What if the key to understanding reality, the very nature of existence and your place within it, was lost for over 1,000 years, not simply misplaced, but actively suppressed, hidden away in scattered texts and forbidden teachings, waiting for a time when the world was ready to listen again? This isn't the plot of a fantasy novel. It is the true story of one of history's most profound and overlooked philosophical traditions. Today, we are going on a journey to recover that lost key, to uncover a system of thought so powerful and complete that it framed the universe as a living, conscious entity, with the human soul as an essential thread in its divine tapestry. This is the forgotten world of the Neoplatonists, the last great philosophers of the ancient world, whose visionary ideas were nearly erased from history. They stood at the precipice of a dying empire, looking into the abyss, and instead of despair, they saw an eternal, radiant truth, a truth we are only now beginning to rediscover. Imagine living in a time of immense upheaval, as the solid ground of the Roman Empire began to crumble. In that chaos, a group of brilliant minds in cities like Alexandria and Athens were piecing together a grand synthesis of all knowledge. They asked the biggest questions one can ask. Where did everything come from? What is the ultimate source of goodness and beauty? And most importantly, what is the purpose of our consciousness, our very soul, in this vast cosmos? The Neoplatonists didn't just offer abstract theories. They provided a detailed map of spiritual ascent, a practical guide for the soul's journey back to its divine origin. They taught that the universe emanates from a single, transcendent source they called the One, a boundless wellspring of reality that is beyond all thought and being. From this ultimate mystery, they described a cascade of divine levels, a cosmic mind, a world soul, and down into the physical realm we inhabit. In their view, you and I are not separate, isolated beings adrift in a meaningless void. We are expressions of the divine, fragments of the ultimate reality that have journeyed into the material world, yet eternally connected to our sublime source. This knowledge was considered so powerful, so transformative, that it threatened the emerging orthodoxies of its time. As one empire fell and new religious structures rose, the expansive, mystical vision of the Neoplatonists was pushed to the margins, their texts condemned, their schools closed. For centuries, their profound spiritual knowledge survived only in fragments, whispered in secret circles and encoded in the works of later mystics and magicians, a hidden river of wisdom flowing beneath the surface of conventional history. But now that river is surging back into the light. We are living in a unique moment where ancient wisdom and modern seeking are converging, and the lost knowledge of the Neoplatonists holds startling relevance for anyone on a spiritual path today. They offer a framework that doesn't reject the world but sees it as filled with divine presence, a path that unites rigorous intellect with deep mystical experience. In this video, we will unveil these secrets together. We will explore their revolutionary conception of the cosmos, understand their practices for spiritual awakening, and see how their vision connects the absolute divine to the innermost core of your own being. This is more than a history lesson. It is an invitation to look at reality through a radically different lens, to recover a sense of wonder and meaning that has been absent for far too long. So, if you're ready to explore the mysteries that connect the soul to the stars, then let's begin. To truly grasp the revolutionary nature of Neoplatonism, we must transport ourselves to the city where it was born, 3rd century Alexandria. Picture a bustling, sun-drenched metropolis at the crossroads of the world, where the grand library of Alexandria, though diminished from its earlier glory, still symbolized an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. This was a place where Greek philosophers argued in the marble colonnades, Egyptian priests preserved ancient rites in towering temples, Jewish scholars debated scripture in the synagogues, and Eastern mystics shared wisdom from Persia and beyond. It was a cultural and intellectual pressure cooker, a place where ideas didn't just coexist, They collided, merged, and transformed into something entirely new. In this vibrant, chaotic, and spiritually hungry environment, the old certainties were breaking down, and people were searching for a unifying truth that could make sense of a complex and changing world. It was the perfect incubator for a system that sought to find the one divine thread weaving through all of reality. At the heart of this intellectual revolution was a man named Ammonius Saccas, a figure who remains shrouded in mystery. We know almost nothing about his life from his own writings because, intriguingly, he never wrote anything down. His teachings were passed on solely through oral instruction to a small, dedicated circle of students. This fact alone tells us something profound about the nature of this nascent wisdom. It was not meant to be a dry academic exercise, but a lived, experiential transmission from teacher to seeker. Ammonius was reportedly born into a Christian family, but returned to the pagan traditions, and his powerful intellect earned him the nickname, the God taught. He taught that the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle were not in opposition, but were two different paths leading toward the same sublime truth. This idea of harmony, of finding the essential unity behind apparent contradictions, became the foundational spark for what was to come. His most famous student, the man who would systemize these ideas and launch a tradition that would span centuries, was Plotinus. When Plotinus arrived in Alexandria, he was a disillusioned seeker who had already studied with numerous philosophers but found their teachings unsatisfying. The story goes that a friend persuaded him to go hear Ammonius lecture. After just one session, Plotinus declared, "This is the man I have been looking for," and he remained with Ammonius for 11 years. This was not a casual student-teacher relationship. It was a deep, transformative apprenticeship in the art of awakening. Under Ammonius's guidance, Plotinus absorbed a way of thinking that was both rigorously logical and profoundly mystical. He learned that the ultimate goal of philosophy was not just to understand the world, but to achieve a direct, unmediated experience of its divine source. This is the core of what would become Neoplatonism. It was never intended to be a mere philosophy in the modern sense of the word. It was a comprehensive spiritual path, a therapeutic and transformative discipline for the soul. Its entire structure was designed for one ultimate purpose: to guide the individual from a state of spiritual ignorance and distraction back to a state of union with the ultimate principle, which Plotinus called the One. Think of it as a detailed roadmap for a journey inward and upward, a step-by-step process of purification and contemplation that would allow the soul to recognize its own divine nature and finally merge with the infinite. The vibrant atmosphere of Alexandria made this grand synthesis possible. Plotinus and his contemporaries weren't working in a vacuum. They had access to centuries of philosophical debate, mystical texts, and religious rituals. They could compare the creation myths of Egypt with the dialogues of Plato, and the monotheism of Judaism with the astrology of Babylon. They acted as spiritual architects, drawing on the strongest materials from every tradition to construct a magnificent, cohesive vision of reality. They asked a daring question: what if all these different paths and stories are actually describing different facets of the same underlying, transcendent reality? This intellectual and spiritual bravery gave birth to a system that was uniquely equipped to address the deepest yearnings of its time, and, as we are rediscovering, of our time as well. So with this grand synthesis taking shape in the intellectual heart of Alexandria, we arrive at the absolute bedrock of the entire Neoplatonist worldview, a concept so radical and profound that it redefines our relationship with existence itself. Plotinus and his followers pointed to a first principle, an ultimate source, which they called simply the One. Now, it's vital to understand that this is not a God in the way we might typically imagine, not a person who thinks, feels, or acts with intention. The One is something far more fundamental and mysterious. It is the source of all personality, all thought, and all being, but it itself exists beyond these categories. It is not a thing among other things, it is the precondition for anything to exist at all. Think of it not as the first domino in a chain, but as the very principle of domino-ness that makes the fall possible. It is utterly transcendent beyond all names and definitions. We cannot properly say what it is, only what it is not. It is not finite, it is not multiple, it is not limited by space or time. It is the ultimate, ineffable mystery, the silent ground of all that is. This might sound abstract, but consider the experience of pure, undirected awareness, a moment of such deep peace or awe that the sense of a separate self simply falls away. In that fleeting instant, what remains is not nothingness, but a profound sense of unity and connection. The Neoplatonists would say that in such a moment you are touching the fringe of the One, not with your intellect, but with the very core of your soul. From this infinite, overflowing source, reality doesn't get created through an act of will or craftsmanship. It simply flows outward, necessarily and eternally. This process is what they termed emanation. The most beautiful and widely used analogy for this is light streaming from the sun. The sun shines and its light radiates outward, illuminating everything it touches. The sun itself is not diminished by this outpouring. It remains complete, whole, and undiminished. The light is a natural and inevitable expression of the sun's very nature. In the same way, the One, in its infinite perfection and superabundance, necessarily overflows, and from this overflow, all of reality emanates in a cascade of ever more complex and defined levels. The first reality to emanate directly from the One is what Platonists called the nous, or divine intellect. If the One is pure, undifferentiated unity, the nous is the first moment of self-awareness, where the universe, in a sense, begins to know itself. This is the realm of perfect, eternal forms or ideas, the archetypes of everything that can possibly exist. Think of the perfect concept of justice, beauty, or tree. These are not just abstract thoughts. In the Neoplatonic view, they are living, dynamic realities in the divine mind, the perfect blueprints from which all lesser copies in our world are derived. From this perfect intellect, the next level emanates, the world soul. If the nous is pure, static thought, the world soul is the principle of life, motion, and organization. It is the active, animating force that breathes life into the cosmos, the intermediary that takes the perfect, unchanging blueprints from the divine mind and projects them into the realm of time and space. It is the soul of the universe itself, the great life force that structures the stars in their courses and pulses through every living creature. And finally, from the world soul emanates the physical, material world that we inhabit, the world of our senses of change, decay, and multiplicity. Notice the direction of this flow, from absolute unity to the unity in multiplicity of the divine intellect, to the dynamic ordering of the world soul, and down into the fragmented, diverse world of matter. This is not a story of creation ex nihilo, but one of unfolding of a great chain of being where each level is a reflection, a little less perfect and unified than the one before it, yet still intimately connected to the sublime source. Matter, at the very edge of this cascade, is the farthest point from the One, the point where the divine light grows most dim, but here is the most crucial and hopeful part of this entire framework. Nothing is ever truly severed or cut off. The connection always remains. Just as a ray of light never truly separates from the sun, our own individual souls are sparks of the world soul, and our minds have the capacity to reconnect with the divine intellect. The entire cosmos is alive, conscious, and fundamentally good, because it is all a radiant expression of the One. This process of emanation solves a profound philosophical puzzle. How can a perfect, unchanging, and utterly simple source give rise to a complex, changing, and imperfect world? The Neoplatonist answer is that it doesn't by acting, but simply by being. Its perfection is so absolute that it cannot help but radiate reality, just as a truly fragrant flower cannot help but fill the air with its scent. The world is not a mistake or a fallen realm in the Gnostic sense. It is a beautiful, though distant, echo of divine perfection, and our purpose is to trace that echo all the way back to its source. So if the One is the silent, unknowable source, the very first thing that emanates from its superabundant reality is what the Neoplatonists called the nous, the divine mind. This is the moment the absolute mystery of the One expresses itself as pure, self-aware intelligence. Picture the One as a boundless, still ocean of potential. The nous is the first perfect wave that rises from that ocean, containing within its arc the entire, intricate pattern of the sea from which it came. It is the first other, the first expression of a subject knowing an object, but here, the subject and the object are the same. The divine mind doesn't just think about reality, it is reality in its most perfect, complete, and unified form. This is the realm of the Platonic Forms, a concept that Plotinus inherited from Plato but expanded into a breathtaking cosmic principle. What are these forms? They are not simply ideas in a god's head. They are the eternal, living archetypes of everything that exists or can exist. Think of the perfect concept of justice. In our world, we see flawed, partial examples of justice, a court ruling, an act of fairness. These are just shadows, imperfect copies, but in the nous there exists the form of justice itself, absolute, unchanging, and perfectly real. The same is true for the form of a circle, which is a perfect, infinite set of points equidistant from a center, unlike any circle we can ever draw in the physical world. The same is true for the form of beauty, of humanity, of a tree. Everything you see around you has its ultimate, perfect prototype in this divine mind. This is not a static museum of concepts. The nous is a living, dynamic, and brilliantly conscious reality. It is a state of instantaneous and total knowing, where every thought is fully conscious of every other thought, all at once, in an eternal, glorious symphony of intelligence. There is no process of learning or discovery here, because everything is already known, completely and perfectly. This is the universe fully understanding and contemplating its own essence. Now, this might seem like a remote and abstract philosophical concept, but the Neoplatonists saw it as the very key to true knowledge. For them, what we call learning in our everyday lives isn't about stuffing new facts into a blank slate. It's actually a process of remembrance, of anamnesis. Your soul, being a fragment of the world soul which itself emanates from the nous, already has latent within it the knowledge of all these eternal forms. When you have a moment of profound insight, when a mathematician suddenly grasps an elegant proof, or an artist intuits the perfect composition, or you have a flash of moral clarity about what is truly right, you are not inventing something new. You are awakening to a truth that has always existed within the depths of your being. You are momentarily aligning your individual mind with the divine mind. This is why the philosophical life was seen as a practice of turning inward. It's a process of quieting the noise of the senses and the chatter of the discursive mind to allow this deeper, intuitive intellect to shine through. The goal is not to become a walking encyclopedia, but to become a clear vessel through which the intelligence of the cosmos itself can flow. You are not trying to build a ladder to reach the nous. You are realizing that you are already standing on one of its branches, and you simply need to recognize your connection to the trunk. This understanding transforms the very purpose of existence. Your life's journey becomes a sacred endeavor to recollect who you truly are, to polish the mirror of your soul so it can reflect the perfect patterns of the divine mind. Every act of genuine understanding, every creation of true beauty, every pursuit of real justice, is a spiritual act that re-anchors you to the highest levels of reality. It is how the cosmos, through you, remembers its own sublime origin. From the luminous stillness of the divine mind, where perfect ideas exist in eternal contemplation, life and movement themselves begin to stir. This is the emergence of the third great principle, the world soul, or what the ancient Latins called the anima mundi. If the nous is the universe thinking, the world soul is the universe living and breathing. It is the dynamic, animating force that flows from the divine intellect. acting as the active intermediary between the perfect, unchanging realm of forms and the ever-changing temporal world we perceive with our senses. The world soul takes the flawless blueprints from the news, the perfect concept of a galaxy, a forest, or a human heart, and it projects them into the framework of space and time, organizing the raw potential of matter into the magnificent, ordered cosmos we inhabit. This is not a random or chaotic process. The world soul operates according to profound, inherent mathematical principles and harmonic ratios, weaving geometry and number into the very fabric of existence. The precise orbits of planets, the spiral patterns of seashells, the rhythmic cycles of the seasons, all of these are the visible, physical expressions of the world soul's intelligent activity. It is the great architect and the vital life force combined, the reason why the universe is not a static collection of objects, but a single, unfolding, and living whole. For the Neoplatonists, this meant that the cosmos itself was literally a divine, conscious being. Every star, every planet, every stone and stream was seen as part of a single, vast living entity, all pulsating with the same underlying life and intelligence. Your own individual soul, in this grand scheme, is not a separate creation dropped into an alien world. It is quite literally a spark, a fragment, of this very same cosmic world soul. You are not a stranger visiting the universe. You are the universe experiencing itself in a localized, individual form. This perspective fundamentally reshapes our relationship with the world around us. It erases the illusion of separation that can lead to feelings of isolation or alienation. When you stand in a forest, you are not an external observer looking at a collection of independent trees. You are one conscious node of the anima mundi communing with other expressions of itself. The wind moving through the leaves, the river carving its path through stone, the gravitational pull holding galaxies together, these are not merely mechanical processes. They are the activities of a unified, living cosmos, a being of almost unimaginable scale and complexity. This ancient vision finds a powerful and poignant resonance in our modern age, particularly within ecological and holistic spiritual movements. The Neoplatonic concept of the world soul presents a philosophical foundation for the intuitive sense that the Earth is a living, interconnected system, an idea popularized in the 20th century as the Gaia hypothesis. It provides a sacred dimension to our understanding of ecosystems, suggesting that the balance of nature is not a lucky accident, but an expression of an inherent cosmic intelligence. To harm the environment in this view is not just a practical mistake, it is a form of self-violation, a failure to recognize that the health of the whole is intimately tied to the health of each of its parts. This worldview also deeply aligns with the experiences reported by mystics and meditators across traditions, the direct, non-intellectual feeling of merging with a vast, conscious presence that permeates all of nature. That overwhelming sense of unity and interconnectedness, of being one with the ocean or the sky, is what the Neoplatonists would describe as your individual soul momentarily remembering its true source in the anima mundi. It is a homecoming to the living cosmos from which you originally emanated. The practical implication of this is a call to live with a sense of sacred participation. Your life is not a solitary struggle against an indifferent universe, but a unique and vital contribution to the experience of a single cosmic being. Every act of creation, every moment of compassion, every effort to bring more beauty or order into the world is not just a personal achievement. It is your fragment of the world soul actively fulfilling its role, adding its specific note to the eternal symphony of a living, breathing, and deeply conscious cosmos. This brings us to one of the most personal and transformative aspects of Neoplatonic wisdom, the journey of your own soul. If the cosmos is a great emanation flowing from the One, and the world soul is the lifeblood of the universe, then where do you, as an individual conscious being, fit into this magnificent tapestry? The Neoplatonists offered a profound and beautiful answer. the descent of the soul, this is not a story of a fall from grace in the sense of a punishment or a tragic error. Instead, think of it as a divine expedition, a necessary voyage from the center of reality out to its furthest frontiers. Your soul originates in the sublime heights of the nous, the divine mind, where it exists as a pure, knowing being, intimately aware of its connection to the source. From there, it is emanated as a unique expression of the world soul, a spark of the cosmic life force destined for a particular mission. The decision to descend into a physical body and enter the realm of matter is an act of divine daring, not a failure. Why would a perfect soul willingly leave its heavenly home for the confusion and suffering of earthly life? The Neoplatonists saw it as an expression of the same superabundant generosity that drives the entire cosmic process. The one overflows with reality, and so too does the soul feel a natural, productive impulse to extend itself, to explore its own creative potential, and to bring order and beauty to the furthest reaches of the cosmos. Imagine a brilliant scholar who possesses all knowledge within the quiet halls of a great library. Their understanding is perfect, but it remains theoretical. To truly fulfill their purpose, they might choose to travel to a remote village, where they must apply their knowledge in messy, real-world situations, teaching others and learning from the challenges themselves. The descent is that journey from the library to the village. It is how the divine expresses itself in the world of action and experience. Upon entering the physical body, however, something profound happens. The soul undergoes a kind of spiritual amnesia. Immersed in the dense, captivating world of the senses, the pull of emotions, the chatter of the discursive mind, the constant input from sight, sound, and touch, the soul gradually forgets its celestial origin. It becomes hypnotized by the reflection of reality, mistaking the physical world for the only world. It starts to identify with its temporary vehicle, the body, and its fleeting concerns, believing, "I am this body, these thoughts, these desires." This is the great forgetting, the cosmic sleep. The pain and alienation we often feel in life are not intrinsic to existence itself. They are the symptoms of this amnesia. It is the deep, homesick longing of a being that has forgotten its true home, trying to find fulfillment in places where it can never be truly found. This creates a powerful and compassionate narrative for the human condition. You are not broken or inherently sinful. You are simply asleep, living under a spell of forgetfulness. The struggles you face, the sense that there must be more to life, the moments of inexplicable beauty that pierce your heart with longing, these are not random. They are echoes from your deeper self, reminders from your divine origin, gently tugging at the veil of forgetfulness. Your entire life, with all its joys and sorrows, becomes the stage for this great drama of remembrance. The ultimate goal, then, is not to escape the world or destroy the body, but to awaken within it. The physical world, for all its challenges, is the very gymnasium where the soul rediscovers its strength. The relationships we navigate, the art we create, the knowledge we pursue, and the suffering we endure, all of it serves as a curriculum designed to jolt the soul back into awareness. Every time you choose compassion over hatred, whenever you recognize truth in a beautiful equation or a piece of music, or when you feel a deep sense of peace in nature, you are not learning something new. You are remembering, you are reclaiming a piece of your divine inheritance, slowly piecing together the memory of who you truly are, an eternal, conscious fragment of the cosmos on a heroic journey of return. But how do we begin this journey of remembrance? How do we, in the midst of our daily lives, start to climb back toward that divine origin? For Plotinus, one of the most accessible and powerful paths was already woven into the very fabric of human experience, our innate response to beauty. He envisioned a spiritual ascent that he called the ladder of love, a step-by-step process where our natural attraction to beautiful things becomes a divine guide, leading us from the world of the senses all the way back to the absolute source of all beauty itself. Imagine a magnificent, winding staircase. where each step you take doesn't just elevate you physically, but transforms your very capacity to see and understand. The journey begins on the most solid and familiar ground, our attraction to physical beauty. This is the first rung of the ladder, when you are stopped in your tracks by the stunning colors of a sunset, the elegant form of a human face, or the harmonious melody of a song. That feeling of being captivated is not an accident or a simple sensory pleasure. For the Neoplatonist, that pull you feel is a spiritual force. It is the faint but unmistakable echo of the divine calling to the divine within you. The beautiful object in the world is a reflection, however dim, of the perfect, eternal form of beauty that resides in the news. Your soul, recognizing this echo, is stirred to life, awakened from its slumber by a homesickness for its true origin. The crucial step here is not to condemn this physical attraction as shallow, but to use it as a starting point. The error is not in appreciating a beautiful body or a lovely painting. The error is getting stuck there, mistaking the reflection for the source. The practice is to take that powerful energy of admiration and curiosity and consciously redirect it inward. When you feel moved by a beautiful sculpture, for instance, don't just stare at the marble. Begin to ask deeper questions. What is it about these proportions that feels so harmonious? What universal principle of symmetry or balance is being expressed here? You are starting to look through the physical object to glimpse the invisible, intelligible principles that make it beautiful. This reflective inquiry is what allows you to step up to the next rung of the ladder, the appreciation of moral and character beauty. As you train yourself to see the principles behind physical beauty, you begin to recognize those same principles manifested in human actions and souls. The graceful arc of a dancer's movement and the graceful arc of a compassionate action both share a common root in the harmony of the divine mind. You start to find a different, more profound kind of beauty in acts of incredible kindness, in a life lived with integrity, in a mind that pursues truth with courage and humility. The beauty of a virtuous character shines with a light that is far more enduring and brilliant than any physical form, because it is a more direct expression of the soul's alignment with the cosmic order. From this elevated perspective, you then ascend to the third rung, the beauty of knowledge institutions and abstract truths, the elegant logic of a mathematical proof, the sweeping narrative of history, the intricate structure of a just society. All of these can stir the same soul-deep feeling of awe and recognition. You fall in love with the beauty of a well-ordered mind and a well-ordered world. At this stage, you are contemplating beauty almost entirely divorced from a single material instance. You are engaging directly with the living ideas in the news. Your love has been transfigured from a passion for a single transient object into a devoted pursuit of eternal truth. Now you are approaching the summit. Having passed through and purified your love on each of these lower rungs, your soul has been trained to perceive reality without the constant distraction of the senses. Your consciousness has turned inward and upward, and you are prepared for the ultimate goal, a direct, unmediated encounter with the source of beauty itself, which is the One. This is not an intellectual understanding. It is a mystical union, a state of ecstasy where the soul, for a glorious moment, transcends its individual self and merges with the ultimate principle. In this supreme experience, you do not see beauty as something outside yourself. You become one with it. You are immersed in a radiance that is beyond form, beyond thought, beyond all duality. It is the beauty that gives birth to all other beauties, the silent, superabundant fountain of all that is lovely and good in the cosmos. And then, of course, the soul must return to the world, but it returns transformed, carrying a spark of that transcendent reality back into daily life. The entire ladder is not about rejecting the world, but about learning to see it correctly, as a magnificent, multi-leveled manifestation of a single beautiful source. Every beautiful thing you encounter, from a flower to a symphony to a selfless act, becomes a doorway, an invitation to begin the climb home. While the ascent up the ladder of love represents a deeply internal and contemplative path, Later Neoplatonists confronted a pressing question: what if the soul is so deeply entrenched in the material world, so clouded by its amnesia, that it cannot climb that ladder through intellectual effort alone? This profound challenge gave rise to one of the most fascinating and misunderstood aspects of the tradition, the practice of theurgy. The very word, derived from the Greek theurgia, means God work or divine working, and it represents a complete shift in spiritual methodology. If the philosophy of Plotinus was a map for the soul's journey home, theurgy was the actual vehicle you could board to make the trip. The great systematizer of this approach was Iamblichus, a 4th century Syrian philosopher who fundamentally disagreed with the notion that a purely human intellect could, through its own power, reliably achieve union with the divine. He observed that most people are simply not Plotinus-like sages. Our souls are too heavy, too entangled with the passions and distractions of bodily life. For Iamblichus, we require divine assistance, a hand reaching down from above to pull us up. Theurgy, therefore, is not about human will commanding spiritual forces, which would be magic or gosha. Instead, it is about creating the perfect conditions, through ritual, symbol, and prayer, to make ourselves receptive to the God's saving grace. It is a cooperative act, where we perform our part with meticulous care, and the divine responds by illuminating our path. Think of it this way: if your soul is a radio that has fallen into a well, simply understanding the theory of radio waves won't get you a clear signal. You need someone to lower a rope to pull you out, or you need to carefully adjust the dials and antenna to finally receive the transmission. Theurgy is that process of adjustment, the ritual tuning of the soul to the frequencies of the higher realities. These rituals were incredibly elaborate and intricate, drawing on a vast symbolic system that saw the entire cosmos as a network of divine signatures and correspondences. The theurgists worked with stones, plants, scents, and symbols, each chosen not for superstitious reasons, but because they were believed to be physical vessels for specific divine energies. A particular herb might be sacred to the god Hermes because it resonates with his intellectual and communicative power. A certain geometric symbol might channel the harmonious energy of Apollo. By assembling these materials in a ritually pure space, often at astrologically potent times, the theurgist was essentially constructing a localized energy field, a bubble of higher reality within the mundane world. The rituals themselves involved complex prayers, invocations, and the singing of special sequences of vowels known as voces magici, words of power. These were not words with lexical meaning, but sounds whose very vibration was thought to mirror the fundamental frequencies of the planetary spheres and divine realms. Chanting them was a way of recalibrating the soul's own vibration, shaking off the psychic grime of material existence and reattuning it to the celestial harmonies. The ultimate goal of many of these rites was the achievement of synesthesia, a visionary state where the practitioner's individual consciousness would temporarily merge with a god or a divine principle. This was not about acquiring powers, but about experiencing a radical purification and reorientation. By momentarily becoming one with a divine being, the soul's innate divinity was reawakened and its connection to the source reaffirmed. It was a spiritual jump-start for a battery that had gone dead. This perspective transforms how we view ritual in a spiritual life. It's not about pleading with distant deities or manipulating the universe for personal gain. It is a sophisticated technology of consciousness, a way of using physical actions and symbols as a language to communicate with the deeper layers of your own being and the cosmos. The careful preparation, the focused intention, and the sacred space all work together to bypass the chattering, analytical mind and speak directly to the divine spark within. In this light, the ancient theurgist and the modern meditator using a mantra or a mindfulness bell are not so far apart. Both are using a repeated, resonant stimulus to quiet the ego and create an opening for a higher state of awareness. Theurgy offers a powerful answer to the feeling of spiritual stagnation. It acknowledges that willpower and intellect alone can sometimes hit a wall, and it provides a tangible, embodied path forward. It says that the divine is not only out there to be contemplated, but actively reaches in here through the very substance of the world, through sacred sounds, through the properties of plants and stones, and through the power of ritualized human action. It is a reminder that the journey home is not a solitary trek, but a sacred dialogue between the seeking human soul and the eternally responding cosmos. This brings us to one of the most tangible and astonishing practices within Theurgy, the animation of statues. For the Theurgist, a statue was far more than an artistic representation of a god. It was a potential vessel, a sacred technology designed to receive and anchor a divine presence within the material world. The process of creating and consecrating such a statue was a meticulous spiritual science, based on the core Neoplatonic principle that the entire cosmos is a web of symbolic correspondences. Every god or divine principle was understood to resonate with specific materials, colors, plants, and geometric forms. A statue dedicated to Apollo, for instance, might be carved from a specific type of laurel wood or a sun-associated stone like yellow jasper, then inscribed with symbols sacred to him, perhaps a lyre or a sun disk. These physical components were not arbitrarily chosen. They were seen as the natural physical body for that particular divine energy, the material elements that were most receptive to its influence. The ritual of animating the statue, known as telesticare or ensoulment, was the profound act of inviting the god to inhabit this specially prepared body. This was not about creating a lifeless idol, but about opening a permanent channel, a stable portal through which the divine could interact with the human realm. The Theurgist would perform elaborate rites of purification for days or even weeks beforehand, cleansing their own soul and the ritual space to create a pristine environment. At the astrologically appointed time, they would begin the invocation, using chants, prayers, and the chanting of those sacred vowel sequences. The goal was to create a resonant field of energy so powerful and so perfectly aligned with the god's nature that the boundary between the spiritual and material would momentarily thin, allowing the divine presence to step across and illuminate the statue. The successful animation was reportedly a palpable event. Ancient sources describe statues beginning to sweat fragrant oils, their faces appearing to change expression or emitting a soft, unearthly light. Some accounts even tell of statues speaking, offering oracles or spiritual guidance to the practitioners, but the primary purpose was not theatrical display, it was spiritual elevation. The animated statue became a powerful focal point for contemplation and communion. A seeker could stand before it and, rather than praying to a distant, abstract deity, could commune directly with the manifest presence of the god. The divine energy radiating from the statue acted as a purifying and illuminating force, helping to recalibrate the soul of the observer, burning away the psychic blockages that kept them trapped in a lower state of awareness. Think of it as a spiritual Wi-Fi router. The Theurgist, through the ritual, successfully established a strong, stable connection to the divine network. The animated statue then broadcast that signal locally, allowing others in its vicinity to connect their own devices, their souls, to that higher frequency. This practice demonstrates a revolutionary understanding of the relationship between spirit and matter. It completely rejects the idea that the physical world is a prison from which to escape. Instead, it views matter as the ultimate receptacle for spirit, a medium through which the divine can be invited to manifest and bless the world. The animated statue was a living proof of the interconnectedness of all levels of reality, a divine seal stamped onto the material world, affirming that the cosmos is, from top to bottom, sacred. This technology of the sacred extended to smaller, more personal objects as well. Theurgists crafted and consecrated amulets, often from specific metals or stones engraved with powerful symbols called characters. These were not lucky charms in a superstitious sense, but portable, focused energy tools. An amulet inscribed with the symbols of the goddess Athena might be worn to strengthen one's capacity for wisdom and strategic thought, its presence acting as a constant, subtle reminder and anchor for that divine quality within the wearer's own soul. Similarly, the ritual use of specific herbs and incenses was a form of aromatic theurgy. Burning myrrh was not just about creating a pleasant smell. It was understood that the smoke of myrrh, through its correspondence with the divine, could carry prayers and purifications directly into the celestial realms, a physical offering transforming into a spiritual conduit. In this way, the entire world became a living grimoire, a book of symbols written by the gods themselves. The theurgist was a reader of this sacred text, learning its language of correspondences in order to participate consciously in the divine dialogue of the cosmos. By engaging with these activated symbols and statues, the human soul could experience a taste of union while still in the body, strengthening its resolve and clarifying its vision for the final, ultimate ascent back to the One. Yet for all the power of these ritual practices, they required a definitive map of the spiritual realms, a precise theology to guide the theurgist's work. This authoritative guide arrived in the form of a mysterious and revered text known as the Chaldean Oracles, a collection of revelatory verses that later Neoplatonists like Proclus and Iamblichus treated with the utmost sanctity, often referring to them as a divine scripture. Imagine a spiritual text that was not written by a philosopher in a quiet study, but was instead believed to have been channeled directly from the gods themselves. This was the profound claim surrounding the Chaldean oracles. They are attributed to a father and son, Julian the Theurgist and Julian the Chaldean, who lived in the 2nd century. The father was said to have performed the sacred rites to invoke the gods, while the son, in a deep trance state, acted as the vessel, speaking the divine verses that were then meticulously recorded. This origin story alone gave the oracles an unparalleled authority. They were not human speculation about the divine, but a direct transmission from the source, making them the closest thing the later Neoplatonic tradition had to a holy book. The cosmology laid out in these poetic and often cryptic verses is both complex and breathtaking. It begins with a supreme, transcendent principle that the oracles call the Father, a figure very much akin to Plotinus's one, an ineffable, unknowable source deep beyond the cosmos. But from this ultimate Father emanates a dyad, a pair of primal principles that set the entire universe in motion. The first is a masculine, intellectual principle, often called the nous or demiurge, the active mind that structures reality. The second is a feminine, life-giving principle, referred to as Hecate or the world soul, who acts as the vital bridge between the intellectual fire of the higher realms and the material world. Hecate stands at the cosmic crossroads, her feet planted in different realms, mediating the divine energies downward and drawing the soul's aspirations upward. This system elaborates on the simpler Neoplatonic cascade by introducing a rich hierarchy of intermediary divine beings, each with a specific function. There are the Inges, the self-generated thoughts of the Father that flash through the cosmos like lightning bolts, carrying divine commands. Then come the Synoches, the beings of continuity who hold the different levels of reality together, preventing the universe from flying apart. And finally, the Teletarchs, the masters of initiation who preside over the sacred rites that can purify the human soul. This intricate spiritual ecology provided a detailed topography of the unseen world, naming its rulers and explaining their functions, which was absolutely essential for the theurgist who needed to know exactly which divine force to invoke for a specific spiritual purpose. Where Plotinus provided the philosophical engine, the why of the soul's journey back to the One, the Chaldean oracles provided the theological chassis and the ritual operating manual. They gave the theurgist a complete symbolic language and a set of practical commandments for navigating the spiritual landscape. For instance, the oracles emphasize the critical importance of ritual purity and the correct performance of ceremonies. They warn against using blood sacrifices or any impure materials. insisting that the highest gods can only be approached with bloodless altars and a soul free from moral stain. This was a clear demarcation between the elevated practice of theurgy and common sorcery. The text also provided powerful symbols and divine names that were considered keys to unlocking specific levels of reality. A theurgist might meditate on a specific geometric symbol described in the oracles to align their soul with the stabilizing power of the synachs, or chant a particular name to call upon the illuminating flash of the anges. Proclus, one of the greatest systematizers of late Neoplatonism, was so devoted to the oracles that he wrote extensive commentaries on them and was said to practice their rituals daily. He saw them as the perfect complement to Plato's dialogues. If Plato gave you the map, the Chaldean oracles gave you the vehicle and the turn-by-turn directions for the journey. What makes this synthesis so powerful is how it unites intellectual understanding with embodied spiritual experience. You could contemplate the nature of the one through the philosophy of Plotinus, gaining an intellectual appreciation of its transcendence. But through the rituals and invocations sanctioned by the Chaldean oracles, you could then actively participate in that reality, feeling the descent of divine power into a consecrated statue or experiencing the uplifting pull of Hecate during a nocturnal rite. It was a complete spiritual ecosystem, offering both a profound metaphysics for the mind and a tangible mysticism for the soul. The loss of the Chaldean oracles as a complete textitude, we only have fragments quoted by later authors, is one of the great tragedies of Western esotericism. These surviving pieces, however, reveal a system that sought to heal the rift between heaven and earth, providing a path for the mortal soul to not only understand the divine hierarchy, but to actively and safely engage with it, fulfilling its sacred purpose of weaving the human and the cosmic back into a single, luminous whole. Yet the philosophical and ritual system we've been exploring did not emerge fully formed. It required a brilliant and determined mind to defend it, systematize it, and establish its practices as the very heart of the tradition. That mind belonged to Iamblichus of Syria, a figure who stands as a monumental pillar in the history of Neoplatonism, a student of Porphyry, who was himself the direct student of Plotinus. Iamblichus found himself at a critical philosophical crossroads. While he deeply respected his teacher, he fundamentally disagreed with him on a point of supreme importance. Porphyry remained closer to the original vision of Plotinus, asserting that the purified human intellect, through its own power of contemplation and virtuous living, could achieve union with the divine. For Porphyry, philosophy was the primary and often sufficient path. Iamblichus looked at the human condition with different eyes. He saw souls not as pure intellects temporarily inhabiting a body, but as complex beings profoundly intertwined with the material world, weighed down by passions and suffering from a deep spiritual amnesia. For such beings, he argued, intellectual understanding alone was like having a detailed map of a mountain you are too weak to climb. You can study the paths, but you lack the strength to take a single step upward. This conviction led Iamblichus to pen his most famous and influential work, On the Mysteries of the Egyptians, a powerful and detailed rebuttal to Porphyry's skeptical questions about ritual practice. In this text, Iamblichus builds an unshakable case for theurgy as the necessary vehicle for the soul's salvation. His central argument hinges on a revolutionary idea that would echo through the ages. He stated that the soul's descent into the body was so complete, its identification with the physical so total, that it could not, by its own will alone, reverse its course and ascend. The human will, no matter how disciplined, is ultimately a faculty of the soul that is already in a fallen state. To expect it to lift itself out of that state by its own bootstraps is a philosophical impossibility. What is required is an intervention from above, a divine grace that reaches down to pull the soul up. Theurgy, for Iamblichus, was the sacred technology designed to invite and receive this grace. He meticulously explained that the gods, in their eternal goodness, are always willing to assist humanity, but we must create the proper conditions to become receptive. The elaborate rituals, the sacred symbols, the chants, and the purifications were not meant to force the gods to appear, a blasphemous and impossible notion. Instead, they were a way of attuning our entire being, body, and soul to the divine frequencies. When we perform a theurgic rite with perfect intention and ritual precision, we are not commanding the divine, we are making ourselves fit to be commanded by it. We are polishing the rust off the mirror of our soul so that it can clearly reflect the light that is always shining upon it. Iamblichus further argued that this divine assistance operates according to a principle of cosmic sympathy. The entire universe is a single, living being, and every part is connected to every other part through invisible chains of influence. A specific stone, plant, or animal is not just a physical object, it is a node of divine energy, a symbol that participates in a higher reality. By incorporating these sacred materials into a ritual, the theurgist is activating a pre-established sympathetic link with a particular god or cosmic power. The ritual becomes a key that turns a lock in the cosmic architecture, opening a channel for divine energy to flow into the material world and into the soul of the practitioner. This was a complete paradigm shift. Iamblichus moved the center of spiritual gravity from the human mind to the cosmic whole. Salvation was no longer a solitary achievement of the philosopher in his study. It became a cooperative venture between the striving human soul and the eternally responsive divine hierarchy. His influence was so profound that he effectively refounded the Neoplatonic school, establishing his own in his native Syria, which attracted students from across the Roman world. After Iamblichus, nearly every major Neoplatonist, from Emperor Julian to the great Proclus in Athens, embraced theurgic practice as the crowning glory of the philosophical life. He provided the theological justification and the practical framework that allowed the grand vision of Plotinus to become a lived, tangible reality for generations of seekers, ensuring that the path back to the One was not just a map to be studied, but a journey that could actually be undertaken. While Iamblichus provided the crucial argument for why Theurgy was necessary, it fell to another monumental figure to build the entire Neoplatonic system into its most polished and comprehensive form, a man who studied and wrote with such relentless energy that his contemporaries claimed he could compose 50 lines of philosophical argumentation while taking a single bath. This was Proclus Lycaeus, who became the head of the Platonic Academy in Athens during the 5th century and is widely regarded as the greatest systematizer of the entire tradition. If Plotinus was the brilliant mystic who first charted the voyage from the one to the many, and Iamblichus was the spiritual engineer who built the vessel to make the journey, then Proclus was the master cartographer who drew the most detailed and intricate map of the entire spiritual cosmos, a map so complete it remains a foundational reference for esoteric thought to this day. Proclus possessed a mind of encyclopedic scope and relentless logical precision. He believed that every aspect of reality, from the highest god to the lowliest stone, could be understood within a single, unified, and hierarchical framework. His life's work was to synthesize every thread of wisdom available to him, the dialogues of Plato, the visionary verses of the Chaldean oracles, the philosophical insights of Plotinus and Iamblichus, along with mathematics, astronomy, and ancient theology, and weave them into one magnificent, seamless tapestry. He didn't just comment on these traditions, he integrated them into a single, coherent system of breathtaking complexity and beauty. At the heart of Proclus's grand synthesis is his theory of the divine hierarchies, a concept that organizes the entire cosmos into a cascading series of triads. For Proclus, the process of emanation from the One is not a simple, linear flow. It is a rhythmic, three-part dance that repeats at every level of reality, a pattern he called mone, prudos, epistrophe, or remaining, procession, and return. Every divine principle first remains in its own nature, true to its origin. Then, out of its superabundant fullness, it processes or flows outward to generate a lower, more complex level of reality. Finally, that lower level naturally turns back, or returns, in a movement of love and longing toward its source, seeking to imitate and reunite with the principle that gave it birth. This triad is not just a philosophical observation, it is the very heartbeat of the cosmos, the fundamental rhythm of all existence. Using this triadic structure, Proclus elaborated an immensely detailed spiritual cosmology. He populated the space between the ineffable one and the material world with a vast community of divine beings, each with a specific role. Immediately following the one, he described a level of transcendent, unparticipated henads or ones, which are pure, individual expressions of the ultimate principle. Beneath these are the intelligible triads, the intellectual triads, and so on, down through the celestial gods who move the planets, to the angelic and demonic beings who act as messengers and guardians, all the way to the world soul and our own individual souls. This was not an arbitrary invention. For Proclus, this intricate hierarchy was a necessary explanation for how a perfectly simple and unified source could give rise to a complex and diverse world without any loss of its own transcendent unity. Each level mediates the divine power to the one below it, adapting the infinite simplicity of the one into forms that more limited beings can receive. One of Proclus's most influential and startling contributions was his rigorous analysis of the nature of evil. In a universe that is an emanation of a perfectly good source, how can evil exist? Proclus offered a profound and nuanced answer. Evil has no substantial reality of its own. It is not a positive force or a competing power against the good. Instead, he defined evil as a parapostasis, a secondary or parasitic existence. It is what happens when a being, at any level of the hierarchy, fails to fully actualize its own nature and falls away from the perfection proper to its station. Think of a knife. The good of a knife is to be sharp and to cut well. A dull knife is not actively evil, but it is a failure to be a good knife. In the same way, a soul that fails to live according to its rational, divine nature, that succumbs to ignorance, greed, or hatred, is not channeling a positive force of evil. It is merely experiencing a privation of its own proper good, a shadow cast by its own turning away from the light. Evil, in this view, is always a lack, a deficiency, a twisting of something that is inherently good. This philosophical stance was incredibly comforting and empowering. It meant that the darkness we encounter in the world and in ourselves is not a fundamental reality to be fought, but a symptom of misalignment to be corrected. The solution to evil is not a cosmic war, but a therapeutic process of reorientation and education, of helping every being remember and return to its true good nature. The practical application of this entire grand system was captured in Proclus's voluminous commentaries on Plato's dialogues. For him, every line of Plato was a divinely inspired text containing multiple layers of meaning, literal, moral, and metaphysical. His commentaries are not dry academic exercises. They are profound spiritual exegeses, unpacking the symbolic and theurgic significance of Plato's myths and arguments. He saw works like the Timaeus as a complete cosmological revelation and the Parmenides as the ultimate theological treatise, mapping the entire journey from the one to the many and back again. Through these texts, Proclus provided a complete curriculum for the philosophical and theurgic life, guiding the student from logical reasoning through to mystical union. His work became the gold standard for later Neoplatonism, a comprehensive guidebook that ensured the survival and transmission of this ancient wisdom. Even as the world he knew was crumbling, he witnessed the removal of the Statue of Victory from the Roman Senate and the rising dominance of Christianity. Proclus continued to teach and write, convinced that this eternal truth would never truly die. His systematic genius created a fortress for Neoplatonic thought, a structure so robust and well-constructed that its fragments would provide the building blocks for Renaissance magi, idealist philosophers, and modern seekers for centuries to come, preserving a vision of a living, conscious, and hierarchically ordered cosmos that forever invites the soul to begin its journey home. Amidst this flourishing of late antique wisdom, where the intricate systems of Iamblichus and Proclus were being taught in the great schools, the city of Alexandria produced a figure whose life and death would come to symbolize the violent end of an era. Her name was Hypatia, and she was far more than just a philosopher. She was a living embodiment of the Neoplatonic ideal, a person who harmonized rigorous scientific inquiry with profound spiritual understanding. Imagine a woman in the early 5th century, a time of increasing tension and sectarian strife, moving through the bustling streets of Alexandria, not hidden away in a secluded library, but as a celebrated public intellectual. The daughter of the mathematician Theon, Hypatia was raised in an environment dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. She surpassed her father's own considerable reputation, becoming the head of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria, where she taught the works of Plato and Aristotle to a diverse and devoted student body that included both pagan and Christian youths. Her lectures were not dry academic affairs. They were transformative events delivered with a charismatic clarity that drew students from across the empire. She represented the very best of the classical world, a commitment to reason, a passion for mathematics and astronomy, and a philosophical life dedicated to the cultivation of virtue and the contemplation of divine truths. Her reputation for wisdom and her impeccable character earned her a unique position of respect and political influence. She became a trusted advisor to Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria, who sought her counsel on matters of governance and ethics. In a city increasingly fractured by the power struggles between the imperial authority, represented by Orestes, and the rising ecclesiastical authority of the Christian bishop, Cyril, Hypatia stood as a neutral and respected figure. She was a voice for reason and moderation in a climate growing ever more dominated by absolutism and zealotry. Her very existence, a pagan woman holding such public sway and intellectual authority, became a point of contention. The tragic turn came as the political and religious conflict intensified. Bishop Cyril, seeking to consolidate his power and eliminate rivals, orchestrated a campaign of vilification against Hypatia. The mob was fed malicious rumors, portraying this brilliant and chaste philosopher not as a seeker of truth, but as a practitioner of dark magic and a dangerous obstacle to the Christianization of the city. The hatred culminated in a horrifying act of public violence. One day in March of the year 415, as Hypatia was traveling through the city, she was ambushed by a mob of Cyril's paramilitary supporters, the Parabolani. They dragged her from her chariot into a church, a place meant for sanctuary, where they stripped her naked and murdered her with broken pieces of pottery, brutally scraping the flesh from her bones. Her mutilated remains were then burned, an attempt to erase her completely from the world. The murder of Hypatia was not a random act of mob violence. It was a calculated political assassination designed to terrorize the intellectual and pagan community of Alexandria. It sent a chillingly clear message. The old world of philosophical inquiry, of religious tolerance, and of public roles for learned women was no longer welcome. Her death marked a profound turning point. With her, the vibrant, syncretic intellectual life that had characterized Alexandria for centuries effectively came to an end. The great library had long been diminished, but now its living spirit, the spirit of open debate and the unity of science and spirituality, was extinguished in the most brutal fashion imaginable. Hypatia's martyrdom became a powerful and enduring symbol. For later historians, she represented the death of classical antiquity and the beginning of what would later be called the Dark Ages, a period where such free and rational inquiry was suppressed. She stands as a timeless icon for the peril faced by reason and tolerance when confronted by dogmatic intolerance, yet her legacy is more than just a tragic ending. It is a testament to the power of a life lived in pursuit of knowledge and virtue. In an age where the lines between science, philosophy, and spirituality are often artificially drawn, Hypatia reminds us that these were once a unified path. She was a mathematician who charted the heavens, a philosopher who contemplated the One, and a teacher who guided souls, all while navigating the complex political realities of her city with grace and integrity. Her story is a haunting elegy for a world that was lost, but it is also a permanent inspiration, a call to protect the space for intellectual freedom and to honor those brave enough to think for themselves, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. Even as the memory of Hypatia's murder cast a long shadow, the flame of Neoplatonic wisdom was not entirely extinguished. It found a final, fortified refuge hundreds of miles to the north, in the city of Athens, where the original academy founded by Plato himself nearly 1,000 years earlier still stood. For centuries, this institution had been the heart of philosophical inquiry, and under the leadership of thinkers like Proclus, it had become the undisputed center of the late Neoplatonic world. Here, in the shaded walkways where Plato once taught, a final generation of philosophers continued the work of contemplating the divine hierarchies, practicing Theurgic rites, and guiding souls on the journey back to the One. This school was the last organized stronghold of the old pagan intellectual tradition, a living library of ancient knowledge operating in a world that was now overwhelmingly Christian. For a time, it existed in a kind of precarious tolerance, seen perhaps as a harmless relic of a bygone age, but that fragile coexistence was about to shatter. In the year 529, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian I, a ruler determined to consolidate both his political power and the religious orthodoxy of his empire, issued a formal edict that targeted the very existence of the Athenian school. The specific legal justification was a ban on pagans teaching and receiving public salaries, a measure intended to strip the academy of its funding and its official standing. But the intent was far more profound and final. This was not merely a budgetary decision, it was an ideological closure, a deliberate severing of the last living link to the classical philosophical tradition. With the stroke of a pen, the school that had nurtured the minds of Aristotle, Plotinus, and Proclus was forcibly shut down. The great doors of the academy were closed, its lectures silenced. This event resonates through history not just as an administrative act, but as a profound symbolic death knell. The closing of the academy represents the moment the river of open pagan inquiry, which had flowed for over a millennium, was officially dammed. It was the culmination of a long process where a certain kind of theological certainty sought to supplant a tradition built on questioning, mystical experience, and the synthesis of all knowledge. The vibrant, complex spiritual ecosystem that Neoplatonism represented, one that could accommodate rigorous logic, mathematical astronomy, and the animation of statues, no longer had an institutional home in the Mediterranean world. The philosophers themselves, the last custodians of this vast knowledge, faced a stark choice: abandon their life's work or flee. According to later historians, a group of these scholars, led by figures like Damascius, the last head of the school, and Simplicius, a brilliant commentator on Aristotle, chose exile. They could not remain in a world that had outlawed the pursuit of wisdom as they understood it. Tradition holds that, seeking a patron who would appreciate their learning, they traveled east to the court of the Persian king Khosrow I, a ruler known for his interest in philosophy and religious tolerance. This desperate journey across empires symbolizes the total displacement of this knowledge. The wisdom of the Greeks was now carried as precious cargo by a band of intellectual refugees, leaving the homeland that had given it birth. While their stay in Persia was brief, a peace treaty between Justinian and Khosrow soon allowed them to return. They could not go back to Athens. The academy remained closed, its legacy scattered. The Great Dispersal had begun. These exiled philosophers took their personal libraries and their profound understanding with them, and in the years that followed, this knowledge began a long, subterranean migration. Some of it would eventually trickle into the intellectual centers of the early Islamic world, where Greek philosophy would be preserved, translated, and reinvigorated by Arab and Persian scholars. Other fragments would be copied and hidden in monastic libraries, waiting centuries for a future renaissance. The closure of the Academy in 529 is therefore far more than a date in a history book. It is a watershed moment that marks the end of antiquity and the beginning of a long period where the unified vision of the Neoplatonists would be fragmented, its light diffused and often hidden. The organized public transmission of their complete system was over. The direct lineage was broken. From this point onward, the lost knowledge of the Neoplatonists would survive not in schools, but in fragments, in whispers, and in the cryptic symbols of those who managed to preserve a spark of its light through the coming ages. And so, with the Athenian Academy shuttered and its philosophers scattered, one might assume that the great river of Neoplatonic thought had finally run dry, vanishing into the sands of history. But a river, when blocked, often finds new subterranean channels through which to flow. The precious manuscripts containing the works of Plotinus, Proclus, and the rest did not simply turn to dust. Instead, they embarked on an extraordinary eastward journey, carried by scholars and translators into the heart of the newly burgeoning Islamic civilization. This was not a journey of conquest, but one of intellectual rescue, a vast and deliberate project of preservation that would ensure this ancient wisdom survived its long winter. As the Islamic Empire expanded, its caliphs and elites, particularly in Baghdad under the Abbasid dynasty, developed an insatiable appetite for knowledge. They established a legendary institution known as the House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah, which was far more than a library. It was a massive translation bureau, a university, and a research center all in one. Here, teams of scholars, often comprising Muslims, Christians, and Jews working side by side, were commissioned to seek out and translate the entire corpus of Greek science, medicine, and philosophy into Arabic. Imagine scrolls and codices saved from ruin, being painstakingly unpacked in this new intellectual capital. A text by Plotinus, for instance, was translated into Arabic under the title The Theology of Aristotle, a misattribution that nonetheless guaranteed its authority and widespread circulation. Through this monumental effort, the complex ideas of emanation, the divine mind, and the world soul were not just preserved, they were reanimated, given a new language and a new intellectual context in which to thrive. This transfer of knowledge was one of the most significant in human history, and it provided the raw materials for a golden age of Islamic philosophy, where Neoplatonic thought would be seamlessly woven into the fabric of Islamic theology and mysticism. The first great architect of this synthesis was the philosopher Al-Farabi, who came to be known as the second teacher after Aristotle himself. Living in the 9th and 10th centuries, Al-Farabi took the Neoplatonic model of emanation and masterfully integrated it with Islamic monotheism. In his groundbreaking work, The Virtuous City, he presents a cosmic hierarchy that would feel deeply familiar to a student of Proclus, yet distinctly Islamic in its apex. For Al-Farabi, the ultimate source is Allah, the necessary existent, who is utterly one and transcendent, mirroring the Neoplatonic one. From this divine unity, a cascade of 10 immaterial intellects emanates, each corresponding to a celestial sphere in the Ptolemaic universe. The first intellect contemplates the necessary existent, and, from that act of contemplation, gives rise to the second intellect, and so on down the chain. The 10th and final intellect in this series is what Al-Farabi identifies with the Islamic angel Gabriel, who is also the active intellect, the divine emanation that is responsible for illuminating the human mind and bringing potential human knowledge into actuality. This was a breathtaking fusion. The impersonal metaphysical structure of Neoplatonism was now aligned with the personal God of Islam and the specific figures of its revelation. The philosopher's goal for Al-Farabi remained the same as it was for Plotinus, through rigorous intellectual and spiritual discipline, to achieve conjunction with this active intellect, thereby attaining ultimate happiness and knowledge. This framework provided a rational and philosophical pathway to understanding prophecy and the structure of the cosmos, one that deeply influenced all who followed. Building directly on al-Farabi's foundation came Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, perhaps the most influential philosopher in the history of the Islamic world. A child prodigy who had mastered Islamic law, medicine, and mathematics by his teens, Avicenna absorbed the translated Neoplatonic texts and pushed their implications further than anyone before him. His most famous contribution is the distinction between essence and existence, a concept with deep roots in Neoplatonic thought. For Avicenna, in any created thing, its essence, what it is fundamentally separate from its existence, the fact that it is. A horse's essence, horseness, does not automatically include its existence. Therefore, existence must be granted to it by an external cause. This chain of causes, Avicenna argued, cannot regress infinitely. It must terminate in a single, necessary being whose very essence is existence. This is God, the only being for whom what it is and that it is are one and the same. This necessary existent in its eternal self-contemplation necessarily emanates the first intellect, and the entire cosmic cascade follows, beautifully systematizing the universe as a necessary overflow of divine perfection. Avicenna also developed a powerful Neoplatonic psychology. He described the human soul as an immaterial substance that comes into existence with the body, but is not dependent on the body for its survival. Using his famous flying man thought experiment, he asked you to imagine yourself created all at once, fully adult, but suspended in a void with no sensory input whatsoever. Even in this state, he argued, you would still have an awareness of your own self. This proves that the soul's consciousness is independent of the body, a self-subsisting spiritual entity on a journey back to its intelligible source. This radical emphasis on the soul's independence and its yearning for the divine provided a powerful philosophical underpinning for the mystical currents already flowing within Islam. It was within the world of Sufism, Islam's inward mystical dimension, that Neoplatonism found its most profound and lasting resonance. Sufi masters and poets, seeking to describe the soul's intimate relationship with the divine, found in Neoplatonic emanation theory the perfect vocabulary. The great Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi, writing in the 12th and 13th centuries, developed a doctrine known as the oneness of being, which envisions all of reality as the self-disclosure of God. The universe, in his view, is a series of manifestations or emanations from the hidden, unknown essence of the divine, which he called the unknowable essence. This mirrors the procession from the one through the news and the world soul. For Sufis, the human goal is to annihilate the ego and realize this fundamental unity, to understand that there is no reality but God, and that the individual soul is a ray of the divine light. The entire Sufi path of spiritual stations and states can be seen as a practical implementation of the Neoplatonic ascent, a methodical purification of the soul to make it a clear mirror reflecting the attributes of the divine. The poetry of Jalaluddin Rumi is saturated with this Neoplatonic spirit. His famous metaphor of the reed flute, separated from the reed bed and longing to return, is a perfect allegory for the soul's descent from its divine origin and its aching desire for reunion. The music it makes is the lament of that separation, and the goal of the spiritual life is to become a hollow reed through which the breath of the divine can sound. This was the ultimate fate of the knowledge that had been exiled from Athens. It didn't just survive in the Islamic world as a museum piece. It was digested, debated, and transformed. It provided the philosophical architecture for some of the most sophisticated theological systems ever conceived and fueled a mystical renaissance that continues to inspire millions. The hidden transmission through the house of wisdom and the minds of these great thinkers ensured that the river of light flowing from the one continued to nourish human consciousness, proving that a truth once discovered can never truly be lost. For centuries, the great river of Neoplatonic wisdom had flowed eastward, finding a new home in the libraries and universities of the Islamic world, while Europe remained largely cut off from its own philosophical heritage. But history has a way of turning in great cycles, and in the 15th century, a cataclysmic event would trigger a massive return of this lost knowledge to the West, setting the stage for one of the most explosive periods of cultural rebirth the world has ever seen. That event was the slow, grinding siege and eventual fall of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, to the Ottoman Turks in the year 1453. For decades, as the Ottoman noose tightened around the great city, a steady stream of Byzantine scholars, recognizing the impending doom, began gathering up their most precious possessions, not gold or jewels, but ancient manuscripts. They packed away crumbling codices containing the complete works of Plato, the dense theological systems of Proclus, the mystical verses of the Chaldean oracles, and the profound writings of Plotinus texts that had been preserved in Greek for a millennium but were almost entirely unknown in Western Europe. When the city's walls were finally breached, this trickle of scholars became a flood. They fled by ship to Italy, carrying this intellectual treasure trove with them, and they arrived at the perfect moment. Italy was in the throes of the Renaissance, a movement obsessed with recovering the glory of classical antiquity. Yet for all their admiration of Roman architecture and Latin poetry, the thinkers of the early Renaissance had a profound gap in their understanding. They had Aristotle, whose logical works had never been lost, but they lacked Plato. They had a philosophy of the earthly world, but not a map for the soul's ascent to the divine. The arrival of these Byzantine immigrés, with their trunks full of Greek manuscripts, was like providing a starving person with a feast after centuries on a diet of bread and water. The epicenter of this intellectual earthquake was Florence, a city bursting with wealth, ambition, and a newfound passion for classical learning. And at the heart of Florence was its unofficial ruler, Cosimo de' Medici, a banker whose power was matched only by his vision for a new kind of society, one where commerce, art, and profound wisdom would intertwine. Cosimo understood that true prestige came not just from wealth, but from being a patron of culture and knowledge. He collected ancient manuscripts with a passion, creating one of the greatest libraries since Alexandria. When a Byzantine scholar named Gemistus Pletho visited Florence and delivered electrifying lectures on Plato, contrasting his luminous philosophy with what he saw as the dry scholasticism of Aristotle, Cosimo was captivated. He realized that in these newly arrived texts lay the key to a complete spiritual and intellectual revolution. He became determined to make Plato speak Latin, and for that, he needed a translator of unparalleled skill and dedication. He found his man in a young, brilliant, and melancholic scholar named Marsilio Ficino. Cosimo essentially commissioned Ficino as his personal philosopher, setting him up in a villa in the Tuscan countryside and providing him with all the manuscripts he needed. Ficino's life's work, as dictated by Cosimo, was to translate the entire corpus of Plato's writings, followed by the monumental works of Plotinus and other Neoplatonists, into Latin. This was not a mere academic exercise, it was an act of spiritual archaeology, an attempt to recover a lost world soul for a new age. Ficino did far more than just translate. He absorbed the Neoplatonic system so completely that it became the very air he breathed. Around the year 1462, under Cosimo's direct patronage, Ficino founded the Platonic Academy in Florence. This was not a university in the formal sense, but a vibrant gathering of the most brilliant minds of the era, artists, poets, philosophers, and powerful patrons, who met at Ficino's villa in Theurgy to read the newly translated texts, discuss the nature of divine love, and perform rituals inspired by what they understood of ancient wisdom. The atmosphere was one of ecstatic discovery. For these Renaissance thinkers, reading Plato and Plotinus was not like studying a historical artifact. It was like discovering a long-lost user manual for the human soul and its relationship to the cosmos. Ficino's own magnum opus, his work titled The Platonic Theology, was a grand synthesis that aimed to prove the immortality of the soul using Neoplatonic arguments, creating a new spiritual philosophy that could coexist with and even enrich Christianity. He saw no contradiction. For Ficino, the Neoplatonists were divinely inspired pre-Christians, ancient theologians who had been granted a glimpse of the same truth that would later be fully revealed in the Gospels. This idea of a perennial philosophy, a single golden thread of truth running through all the world's wisdom traditions, became a central tenet of the Renaissance mind. The impact of this rediscovery was immediate and revolutionary, exploding beyond the walls of the Academy and igniting the artistic imagination of the entire era. Artists were no longer seen as mere craftsmen. They were now considered divine creators themselves, channeling the perfect forms from the Muse into physical matter. When Sandro Botticelli painted his masterpieces The Birth of Venus and Primavera, he was not simply illustrating pagan myths. He was creating a theurgic act on canvas. These works are dense with Neoplatonic symbolism, depicting the soul's birth from the sea of divinity and its ascent through the different levels of love and beauty, guided by celestial beings. The elegant, elongated figures and the dreamlike atmosphere are not just stylistic choices. They are visual representations of the soul's yearning to escape the grossness of matter and return to its ethereal home. Similarly, the architectural principles of Filippo Brunelleschi and Leon Battista Alberti, based on harmonic ratios and geometric perfection, were direct applications of the belief that the physical world should mirror the mathematical order of the divine mind. They were building a world that was itself a reflection of the higher reality, a bridge between the human and the divine. This Neoplatonic spark even transformed how people saw themselves. The Renaissance ideal of the universal man, the individual who could excel in art, science, politics, and philosophy, was a direct embodiment of the Neoplatonic concept of the soul as a microcosm of the entire cosmos. By developing all of their faculties, a person could actualize the divine potential within them and participate more fully in the grand chain of being. Through Ficino's tireless work and Cosimo's visionary patronage, the lost voice of Plato, silent in the West for nearly 1,000 years, was heard again, and it spoke directly to the heart of a culture ready to be reborn, infusing art, science, and spirituality with a new, or rather, a very old, vision of a living, conscious, and beautiful universe. At the very heart of this Florentine revival stood a man whose life's work became the conduit for this ancient river of light, Marsilio Ficino. Cosimo de' Medici's chosen philosopher was more than a translator. He was a spiritual vessel, a man who felt the living pulse of the Neoplatonic world, used so deeply that he didn't just interpret the texts, he seemed to breathe them into life. Imagine the immense responsibility he must have felt, holding these fragile, 1,000-year-old manuscripts, knowing they contained a wisdom that had been absent from the West for centuries. His task was to make them speak again, not as dead letters, but as a living voice for a new age. Ficino approached this monumental project with a sense of sacred duty, believing he was participating in a divine mission to heal the soul of Europe. His translations of the entire works of Plato and later, the monumental Enneads of Plotinus, were acts of love and meticulous care, rendered into a Latin that was both elegant and spiritually resonant. He worked with an almost superhuman focus, driven by the conviction that these words held the key to a more harmonious, enlightened, and soulful way of living. Through his efforts, figures like Socrates and Plotinus stepped out of the shadows of history and became vibrant, immediate presences in the minds of Renaissance thinkers. Ficino's own magnum opus, the Platonic Theology, stands as a towering achievement of synthesis and original thought. In this sprawling work, he undertook an audacious project to construct a grand philosophical system that would prove the immortality of the soul using the very tools of Neoplatonic reasoning, thereby creating a bridge between pagan wisdom and Christian faith. He argued that the soul, being self-moving and the source of life for the body, must be immortal by its very nature. It occupies a unique middle ground in the great chain of being, a microcosm that reflects the entire cosmos, capable of descending into the material world to govern the body, yet also able to ascend through contemplation to unite with the divine mind and ultimately with God himself. For Ficino, this wasn't just a theological argument, it was the foundation for a complete way of life, one that celebrated the dignity and divine potential inherent in every human being. Two of the most potent ideas that Ficino pulled from the Neoplatonic wellspring and poured into the Renaissance imagination were the concept of the anima mundi, or world soul, and the transformative power of spiritual love. The anima mundi, for Ficino, was not a remote philosophical abstraction. It was a living, breathing reality, the divine life force that animates the entire cosmos, the invisible glue that binds the stars in their courses and pulses through every leaf, stone, and human heart. He saw the universe as a single, vast, conscious organism, and this understanding shattered the medieval view of a stark separation between a transcendent God and a fallen, material world. In Ficino's vision, the physical realm was not a prison to escape, but a temple filled with divine presence, a beautiful emanation of God's creative power. This idea had profound practical implications. It meant that nature was not something to be dominated or feared, but to be studied, revered, and learned from. It encouraged a new, empathetic relationship with the natural world, suggesting that by understanding the harmonies of the cosmos, the music of the spheres, the geometric principles in plants, the influences of the planets, one could better understand the mind of the Creator. This directly fueled the burgeoning interests in what we would now call science, medicine, and natural magic, all seen as legitimate paths to divine knowledge. Alongside this cosmic vision, Ficino passionately championed the Neoplatonic theory of love, which he articulated in his commentaries on Plato's Symposium. For him, love was the fundamental cosmic force, the magnetic attraction that draws all things back toward their divine source. He distinguished between a lower, vulgar love that is fixated on physical possession, and a higher, spiritual love, what he called Platonic love, which is the soul's recognition of divine beauty in another person. When you feel a deep, pure admiration for someone's virtue, intelligence, or inner beauty, that feeling is not merely a human emotion. It is a divine energy moving through you, pulling your soul upward on the ladder of ascent. This spiritual love between individuals becomes a mutual aid society for the soul, where friends act as mirrors for one another, reflecting the divine light and helping each other polish away the imperfections that obscure their true nature. The impact of Ficino's work exploded beyond the scholarly circles of his academy and directly into the studios of the era's greatest artists, providing them with a new symbolic language and a profound spiritual purpose. No one embodies this fusion more perfectly than the painter Sandro Botticelli. When you look at his iconic masterpiece, The Birth of Venus, you are not simply seeing a beautiful woman emerging from the sea. You are witnessing a visual sermon on the Neoplatonic journey of the soul. The painting is a detailed allegory, with each element charged with Ficinian meaning. Venus herself represents not physical lust, but Venus Urania, the celestial goddess of divine, intellectual love. She is born from the sea, which symbolizes the fecund, generative waters of the world soul. The wind gods Zephyr and Aura, blowing her toward the shore, represent the inspiring breaths of the spirit that guide the soul into the world of form. And the figure of Hora, ready to drape a cloak embroidered with flowers over the goddess, signifies the moment the pure, divine soul prepares to be clothed in the beautiful, yet limiting, garment of the material body. The entire composition is a meditation on the soul's descent into the world, not as a fall, but as a sacred birth filled with potential and beauty. Similarly, his complex work Primavera is a dense tapestry of Neoplatonic symbolism, depicting the soul's progression through the different stages of love and spiritual awakening under the watchful eyes of Mercury, who represents the intellect that can guide the soul back to the divine. Botticelli was not just illustrating myths. He was using paint and canvas to perform a kind of visual theurgy, creating portals to higher realities that could elevate the consciousness of the viewer. This new philosophical foundation transformed the very role of the artist. They were no longer seen as simple craftsmen fulfilling a commission, but as divinely inspired creators, or alter deus, a second god. Just as the divine mind contemplated the perfect forms and the world soul projected them into matter, the Renaissance artist, filled with this spiritual love and attuned to the anima mundi, would internalize these perfect ideals and then re-manifest them in the world through their art. A sculptor like Michelangelo was not just carving a block of marble. He was liberating the ideal form of David that was already hidden within the stone, guided by his inner vision of divine beauty. This gave art a new dignity and a sacred mission, making it an essential vehicle for humanity's spiritual education and a vital part of the soul's journey back to its source. Through Ficino's translations and teachings, the lost knowledge of the Neoplatonists ceased to be a historical curiosity and became the vibrant, beating heart of the Renaissance, proving that when ancient wisdom finds a willing vessel, it can illuminate the world anew. This idea of a single, golden thread of truth running through history is one of the most captivating beliefs that animated the Renaissance mind, and it provided the very reason why figures like Ficino felt such a profound reverence for the Neoplatonic texts they were translating. They weren't just recovering Greek philosophy, they were, in their eyes, restoring a sacred, primordial revelation. This concept was known as the Prisca Theologia, or ancient theology. It was the belief that in the distant, misty past, God had bestowed a complete and perfect wisdom upon the first great sages of humanity, a pure theology that contained the essential truths about God, cosmos, and the human soul. Over the centuries, this pristine revelation became fragmented, dispersed across different cultures and languages, but its core truths could still be found, like diamonds scattered in the sand, within the world's oldest wisdom traditions. For a Renaissance thinker, this was a thrilling intellectual treasure hunt. The goal was to gather these scattered fragments from the Persians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and even the Hebrews, and piece them back together to reconstruct the original, divine philosophy. At the very head of this lineage of divinely inspired sages stood the legendary figure of Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice great Hermes. He was seen as a real historical sage priest-king, an Egyptian contemporary of Moses, who was the author of a collection of profound Greek texts known as the Corpus Hermeticum. These texts, which Ficino was actually ordered by Cosimo de' Medici to translate before he even began his work on Plato, spoke in a language that felt both ancient and electrifyingly fresh. They described a cosmic God, a divine mind, a living world, and the possibility of the soul's spiritual rebirth and ascent. The Hermetic writings resonated so powerfully with the Neoplatonic system that Ficino and his contemporaries became convinced that Plato himself had been a student of this ancient Egyptian wisdom, that his brilliant ideas were essentially a Greek interpretation of the teachings of Hermes. This belief created an unbroken chain of authority, from Hermes Trismegistus in Egypt, to Zoroaster in Persia, to Orpheus in Thrace, and then to Pythagoras and finally Plato in Greece. This was the ancient theology, and Neoplatonism was its most complete and sophisticated philosophical expression. This syncretic belief system did something absolutely crucial for the Renaissance. It gave Neoplatonism an aura of divine, primordial authority that made it not just acceptable, but incredibly prestigious. In a culture that was still deeply Christian, the rediscovery of pagan philosophers could have been seen as a threat, a heretical return to a pre-Christian darkness. But the Prisca Theologia completely flipped this narrative. It argued that these pagan sages were not heretics at all, but Gentile prophets who had been granted a divine illumination before the coming of Christ. They were venerable ancient theologians, not rival religious figures. Their wisdom was not an alternative to Christianity, but a magnificent prelude to it, a preparation of the pagan world to receive the ultimate revelation of the gospel. This provided a safe and exhilarating intellectual space for scholars to explore these radical ideas. They could enthusiastically embrace the Hermetic and Neoplatonic vision of a living, conscious, divine cosmos without feeling they were betraying their faith. In fact, many, like Ficino, believed they were enriching their faith, using this ancient wisdom to build a grander, more universal understanding of God's plan. This syncretism reached its most audacious form in the work of the philosopher Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a brilliant and fiery young prodigy who was a close associate of Ficino. Pico famously sought to synthesize all known knowledge, not just Hermeticism and Platonism, but also Aristotelian philosophy, Kabbalah from the Jewish mystical tradition, and Christian theology into a single, monumental system. In his oration on the dignity of man, a text often called the Manifesto of the Renaissance, Pico imagines God telling Adam that he has been placed at the very center of the creation, with no fixed nature, but with the freedom to ascend to the divine or descend to the brutish. This powerful idea of human potential and self-creation is deeply Neoplatonic in its vision of the soul's ascent, but Pico fortified it with citations from an astonishing range of sources, all of which he believed were saying the same thing in different languages. He argued that the mystical numerology of Pythagoras, the symbolic geometry of the Egyptians, the angelic hierarchies of the Kabbalah, and the metaphysical structure of Neoplatonism were all different paths up the same sacred mountain. This quest for a universal harmony had a profound and very practical consequence. It legitimized the study of magic. In this worldview, what we might call magic was not demonic sorcery, but a sacred science. It was the practical application of the Prisca Theologia, the knowledge of the hidden sympathies and correspondences that the world soul had woven throughout the cosmos. A Renaissance mage, armed with the knowledge of which herbs were ruled by which planets, or which symbols resonated with which angels, was not trying to defy God's will. He was instead a clever and pious natural philosopher, learning to operate the divine machinery of the universe, using the laws God himself had inscribed into creation to draw down celestial influences for healing, wisdom, and spiritual growth. This was natural magic, and it was seen as the highest form of practical science, a way of actively participating in the divine order revealed by the ancient sages. The belief in the ancient theology created an intellectual atmosphere of incredible optimism and boundless curiosity. It meant that every ancient text, every myth, every symbol, could potentially hold a fragment of the original divine truth. This fueled the explosive creativity of the era, encouraging artists, scientists, and philosophers to look beyond the narrow confines of medieval scholasticism and explore a much wider and more colorful world of ideas. It was this harmonious, syncretic vision that allowed the lost knowledge of the Neoplatonists to be not merely tolerated, but embraced as the very key to a spiritual and intellectual rebirth, a recovery of the world's original and sacred understanding of reality. This profound synthesis of ancient wisdom didn't just remain in the rarefied air of the Platonic Academy. It seeped into the very foundations of a much broader and more mysterious current of thought, the Western esoteric tradition. Here, the grand architecture of Neoplatonism, with its cascading levels of reality and its journey of the soul, provided the essential philosophical skeleton upon which two other great streams of wisdom were draped: the transformative art of alchemy and the divine linguistics of Kabbalah. Together, they formed a powerful, syncretic river of spiritual practice that viewed the entire cosmos as a text to be decoded and a laboratory for divine union. At first glance, the soot-stained furnaces of the alchemist might seem a world away from the abstract purity of the Neoplatonic one, yet for the Renaissance alchemist, their work was never merely about turning lead into gold. That was simply the outward, material sign of an inward, spiritual process. The true, great work of alchemy was the salvation and perfection of the alchemist's own soul, a journey of purification and ascent that mirrored the Neoplatonic path with stunning precision. The entire alchemical process was understood as a dramatic reenactment of the cosmic drama of emanation and return. The base metal, or prima materia, represented the soul in its fallen, chaotic state, the raw, unformed matter at the farthest edge of the divine cascade, dense with potential but imprisoned in confusion. The first stage, negrido or blackening, was the necessary dissolution, the descent into the darkness and putrefaction where the old, rigid identity of the ego had to be broken down. This was the soul's confrontation with its own spiritual amnesia, a painful but essential unmaking. From this blackness emerged the albedo, or whitening, a stage of purification and washing where the soul began to be cleansed of its passions and attachments, reflecting the soul's ascent toward the clarity and light of the nous, the divine mind. The final stage, rubedo, or reddening, represented the ultimate goal, the creation of the philosopher's stone, the perfect, incorruptible substance that could transmute all it touched. In spiritual terms, this was the soul fully reunited with its divine source, having integrated all aspects of itself and become a perfected, radiant being, a true embodiment of the one in the microcosm of the individual. The alchemist, sweating over his alembics and retorts, was therefore a theurgist of matter. He believed that by performing these operations on physical substances, he was participating in a sympathetic magic that directly affected his own spiritual substance. He was co-operating with the world soul to accelerate the natural process of cosmic return, using the symbolic language of chemistry to enact his own salvation. This is why so many alchemical texts are filled with mystical illustrations of kings and queens, dragons and eagles. They are not literal instructions, but symbolic maps of the soul's inner landscape, a Neoplatonic psychology encoded in the language of the laboratory. Simultaneously, another profound fusion was taking place, this time between the emanationist map of Neoplatonism and the intricate tree of life from the Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah. When Christian scholars like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola encountered Kabbalah, they experienced a shock of recognition. They saw in its central symbol, the tree of the Sephiroth, a divinely revealed diagram that perfectly illustrated the Neoplatonic process of emanation. The 10 Sephiroth emanations, or attributes through which the infinite, unknowable God, the Ein Sof, interacts with creation, were understood as a direct parallel to the hierarchical levels of the Neoplatonic cosmos. The highest Sephira, Keter, or the crown, was seen as a beautiful correlate to the Neoplatonic one, the first ineffable point of emergence from the divine absolute. The subsequent Sephiroth, like Chakma, wisdom, and Bina, understanding, mirrored the dynamic relationship between the nous and the world soul, representing the principles of active, outpouring intelligence and receptive, formative understanding. The lower Sephiroth, governing attributes like justice, mercy, and foundation, describe the further articulation of divine qualities into the structured reality we inhabit. This synthesis, known as Christian Kabbalah, was not seen as a borrowing from another religion, but as the recovery of a lost part of the Prisca Theologia. Pico and his followers believed that Kabbalah was the original divine revelation given to Moses on Sinai, a mystical key to the hidden meanings of the Hebrew Scriptures. By combining its detailed map of the divine realms with the philosophical rigor of Neoplatonism, they felt they were reconstructing the complete picture of God's relationship with the cosmos. The practical application of this fusion was mesmerizing. Kabbalah provided a theurgic technology based on the power of Hebrew, considered the original language of God. Each letter of the Hebrew alphabet was not just a symbol, but a vessel of creative power, a building block of reality itself. By meditating on the names of God associated with each Sephira, or by performing complex permutations of sacred letters known as gematria, the Christian Kabbalist sought to climb the tree of life. This was a linguistic and meditative ascent, where the practitioner would consciously direct their awareness up through the Sephirotic layers, purifying their soul at each stage to become a vessel for the divine light flowing down from Keter. It was a new form of Theurgy, using the sacred alphabet as a ladder to achieve what Platonists called the flight of the alone to the alone. This rich confluence of Neoplatonism, alchemy, and Kabbalah created a unique spiritual ecosystem that dominated Western esotericism for centuries. It presented a universe that was fundamentally intelligible and participatory. The cosmos was a book written by God in the languages of nature, number, and Hebrew letter. The human soul was a microcosm of that entire structure, and the purpose of life was to learn these languages in order to consciously undertake the journey back to the source. This was not a path of passive faith, but of active Gnostic seeking, a direct experiential knowledge of the divine achieved through philosophical study, ritual practice, and inner transformation. It empowered the individual seeker with the audacious belief that they could, through their own disciplined efforts and with divine grace, recover their forgotten divinity and participate in the ultimate redemption of the entire cosmos. But what happens when this ancient river of light, having flowed through the Renaissance, encounters a world being reshaped by religious warfare and a new mechanistic science? In 17th century England, a country torn by civil war and sectarian violence, a remarkable group of thinkers at the University of Cambridge provided a powerful and peaceful answer. They became known as the Cambridge Platonists, and their mission was to heal the bitter divides of their time by reviving the harmonious spirit of Neoplatonism. While their world was one of emerging Puritanism and the rising philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, which viewed the universe as a vast, impersonal machine and human life as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, the Cambridge Platonists offered a radically different vision. They argued that the universe is not a dead mechanism but a living, spiritual reality, permeated by the presence of a benevolent God, and that our primary tool for understanding it is not blind faith or scriptural literalism, but reason illuminated by a divine inner light. The leading voices of this group, figures like Benjamin Whichcote, Henry Moore, and Ralph Cudworth, were not reclusive mystics but active clergymen and respected university professors. They were deeply troubled by the dogmatic fervor that had led Christians to persecute and kill one another over fine points of doctrine. Whichcote, who is often considered the father of the movement, famously stated that the spirit of man is the candle of the Lord, a beautiful summation of their core belief. This meant that God had not left humanity with only an external, written revelation, but had also planted within every human soul a natural faculty for perceiving divine truth, a spark of the divine intellect itself. This inner light, which they also called the divine sagacity, was what they identified with true reason. For them, reason was not the cold, calculating logic of a machine, but a receptive, intuitive capacity to recognize truth, goodness, and beauty. It was the very voice of God within the soul, a universal human endowment that could guide individuals toward a moral and spiritual life. This conviction allowed them to stand against the twin threats they saw in their age. On one side, the harsh predestination and dogmatic certainty of some Puritan factions, and on the other, the emerging materialist philosophy of Hobbes, which left no room for spirit, purpose, or God in the cosmos. Against religious dogmatism, they argued that a loving God would not restrict his truth to a single, narrowly interpreted text or a select group of the elect. Why would God give humanity the magnificent gift of reason only to demand that it be silenced in matters of faith? They championed a religion of the spirit over a religion of the letter, suggesting that the essence of Christianity was the Christ-like life of moral integrity and love, not the rigid adherence to man-made doctrines. In this, they echoed the Neoplatonic emphasis on the soul's inner turn and its innate connection to the divine. Simultaneously, they launched a sophisticated philosophical counterattack against the rising tide of materialism. When Hobbes argued that all that exists is matter in motion, and that even thought is merely a mechanical computation in the brain, the Cambridge Platonists responded with powerful Neoplatonic arguments. Henry More, in particular, engaged in a long intellectual debate with Hobbes. He argued that the phenomena of consciousness, free will, and our innate sense of morality and beauty simply cannot be explained by the random collision of atoms. How could mere matter produce the concept of justice, the feeling of awe at a starry night, or the selfless act of love? These, More insisted, are clear evidence of a non-material spiritual reality, a spirit of nature that animates and orders the world, a concept directly descended from the Neoplatonic world soul. Ralph Cudworth further developed this idea with his theory of plastic nature. He proposed that God does not micromanage every event in the world like a celestial puppet master, which would be beneath divine dignity. Instead, God works through a subordinate, unconscious spiritual force, this plastic nature which automatically executes the divine plan in the natural world. It is this force that guides the growth of a seed into a specific plant, the instinctual behavior of animals, and the orderly motions of the planets. This was a brilliant synthesis that reconciled the new scientific discoveries with a spiritual worldview. It allowed for the lawful, predictable operations of nature that science was beginning to describe, while still affirming that these laws were the expression of a divine, intelligent presence. The universe for the Cambridge Platonists was therefore a manifestation of a divine wisdom, a vast living text whose language was mathematics and whose author was a god of reason and love. Their enduring legacy was to carve out a vital middle path, a space where faith and reason were not at war, but were partners in the soul's quest for truth. They demonstrated that spirituality could be intellectually rigorous and that reason, properly understood, was itself a sacred faculty. In an age once again often polarized between militant skepticism and rigid fundamentalism, the serene and hopeful vision of the Cambridge Platonists stands as a timeless reminder that the human mind, when touched by the divine, can be a candle illuminating a path toward a more compassionate and enlightened world. Even as the serene reason of the Cambridge Platonists sought harmony, a new and powerful emotional current was beginning to swell across Europe, one that would find in Neoplatonism not a philosophical refuge, but a passionate cry of the heart. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries was a direct rebellion against the cold, mechanical universe of the Enlightenment, a world seemingly reduced to cogs and equations. The Romantics yearned for wonder, for the sublime, for a world alive with spirit, and they discovered a ready-made language for this longing in the ancient vision of the Neoplatonists. No one embodied this more perfectly than the English poet William Wordsworth. His famous lines, written while reflecting on the view from a bridge, are a pure expression of the Neoplatonic world soul, and I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, in the round ocean and the living air, in the blue sky and in the mind of man. This presence is not a distant god, but the anima mundi itself, a cosmic life force deeply interfused throughout all of nature and within the human consciousness. For Wordsworth, the natural world was not a collection of objects to be studied, but a living, divine teacher. His concept of childhood, where we arrive, trailing clouds of glory, is a poetic rendering of the soul's descent, still remembering its celestial home before the shades of the prison house of adult life and sensory distraction begin to close in. The poet's task in this view is to reawaken that memory, to help us see the world not with the habitual eye of custom, but with the fresh, visionary gaze of the soul that recognizes the divine in a field of daffodils or the silence of the mountains. His contemporary, the fiery visionary William Blake, took this interior vision even further, constructing an entire mythological universe that is profoundly Neoplatonic in its structure, though fiercely original in its expression. Blake raged against the single vision of Newtonian science, which saw only a dead, measurable world. For him, the physical universe was merely the vegetable glass of nature, a limited perception of a much greater spiritual reality. His central myth of the fall of the universal man, Albion, into division and materiality is a dramatic retelling of the soul's descent. The goal of his colossal prophetic books is the restoration of Albion to his unified divine state, a process of overcoming the fragmentation of the self and achieving what he called fourfold vision, a state of consciousness where the divine reality is perceived directly and in its fullness. Blake's concept of eternity is not a future heaven, but the Neoplatonic intellectual realm, the world of the news, where we truly live when we are engaged in creative acts of imagination. For Blake, as for Plotinus, the true God was not an external lawgiver, but the human imagination itself, the divine faculty within us that can perceive the eternal in the temporal. This romantic spirit, born in Europe, found a vibrant new home across the Atlantic in the movement known as American Transcendentalism. Ralph Waldo Emerson, its central figure, was deeply steeped in the Neoplatonism that had been filtered through the writings of Coleridge and the German idealists. His seminal essay, Nature, is practically a Neoplatonic manifesto for the New World. Emerson's Oversoul is a direct translation of the world soul and universal mind, in which every particular human soul participates. We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles, he wrote. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. This belief led him to his famous doctrine of self-reliance, which is far more than mere individualism. It is the conviction that because the divine Oversoul speaks through each of us, we must trust our own inner intuition over the dead traditions of the past. To look to ancient scriptures or external authorities for truth is to ignore the fountain of light within our own breast. Emerson's friend and protege, Henry David Thoreau, put this philosophy into practice at Walden Pond. His 2-year experiment in simple living was a deliberate exercise in Neoplatonic asceticism, a withdrawal from the mass of men who lead lives of quiet desperation in order to strip away the distractions of society and encounter the essential truths of existence directly through nature. By simplifying his life, Thoreau was polishing the mirror of his soul, trying to see if he could not learn what it had to teach, to hear the whisper of the Oversoul in the wind and the water. His meticulous observations of the thawing sand and clay on the railroad cut, where he saw the very patterns by which nature creates leaves and animal forms, is a scientific and mystical contemplation of the formative principles of the world soul, a patient study of how spirit expresses itself in matter. Perhaps the most surprising and impactful modern resonance of Neoplatonic thought, however, emerged not in poetry or nature writing, but in the clinical setting of the psychologist's office. The pioneering work of Carl Jung, who broke from Freud to explore the deepest layers of the human psyche, reveals a structure that is astonishingly similar to the cosmology of Plotinus and Proclus. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious is a direct psychological counterpart to the Neoplatonic nous, or divine mind. It is not a personal unconscious filled with repressed individual memories, but a transpersonal inherited stratum of the psyche common to all humanity, the foundation of our very consciousness. And what are the fundamental structuring elements of this collective unconscious? Jung called them archetypes, the primordial, universal patterns of behavior and perception that govern human experience. The mother, the hero, the trickster, the wise old man, the anima and animus, these are not learned concepts, but innate pre-existing forms within the psyche. They are in essence the Platonic forms translated into the language of modern psychology. Just as the form of justice exists in the nous and is imperfectly reflected in worldly acts of justice, the archetype of the hero exists in the collective unconscious and is manifested in the specific stories of a Hercules, a Luke Skywalker, or an individual's own journey of self-overcoming. For Jung, the process of individuation The lifelong project of integrating the conscious ego with the contents of the unconscious to become a whole, authentic self is the modern psychological version of the soul's ascent back to the One. The archetypes are not merely passive forms, they are living, dynamic forces within us. When we encounter them in our dreams, our fantasies, or our profound emotional reactions, we are engaging with the same divine realities that the Theurgists sought to invoke through ritual. Jungian therapy, in this light, can be seen as a form of secularized theurgy, a process of making the unconscious conscious in order to heal the fragmentation of the soul and restore its connection to its deep, transpersonal source. This profound parallelism suggests that the Neoplatonists were not just building philosophical castles in the sky, they were mapping the innate, enduring architecture of the human psyche itself. Their vision of a layered reality, from the dense physical world up through the realm of perfect forms to an ineffable source, finds a powerful echo in our modern understanding of the mind, revealing that the journey inward and the journey upward are, and perhaps always have been, one and the same. This understanding of a single, unified reality, so central to the Neoplatonic vision, is not an isolated philosophical curiosity. In fact, it represents a powerful Western articulation of a truth that appears at the very heart of the world's great wisdom traditions, particularly in the non-dual teachings of the East. When we place the Neoplatonic one side by side with concepts like Brahman from Advaita Vedanta or the Dharmakaya from Mahayana Buddhism, we are not just drawing superficial parallels. We are witnessing different languages attempting to describe the same ineffable summit of human understanding. The core realization is that the fragmented, separate world we perceive with our senses is an illusion, a veil, and that underlying all apparent multiplicity is a single, undivided, conscious reality. The Neoplatonists called this the One, the ultimate principle that is beyond all names and forms, the source from which everything emanates and to which everything ultimately returns. In the Hindu tradition of Advaita Vedanta, which means non-duality, this same ultimate reality is called Brahman. Brahman is described as Sat-Chit and absolute being, absolute consciousness, and absolute bliss. It is not a god that rules the world from afar, but the very substance of the world itself, the sole reality that exists. The famous Upanishadic phrase Tat Tvam Asi, or Thou art that, is a direct and shocking declaration of this unity. It asserts that your innermost self, the Atman, is not a small, individual soul separate from the cosmos, but is, in its deepest essence, identical with Brahman, the ultimate reality. The sense of being a separate person, with your own private thoughts and desires, is the primary ignorance, the Maya or cosmic illusion that the spiritual path seeks to dispel. This is a stunningly precise echo of the Neoplatonic journey. For Plotinus, the soul's descent into the body brings with it the forgetting of its divine origin, the mistaken identification with the physical form and the personal mind. The entire philosophical and theurgic path is designed to reverse this amnesia, to recollect that the individual soul is a spark of the world soul, which itself emanates from the nous and the One. The ultimate goal, the henosis or union, is to realize that you were never truly separate to begin with. The Buddhist path, while using a different framework that avoids a permanent, substantial self, arrives at a remarkably similar destination regarding the nature of reality. In Mahayana Buddhism, the ultimate truth is shunyata, or emptiness. This does not mean a nihilistic void, but rather that all phenomena are empty of independent, inherent existence. Nothing exists on its own. Everything is interdependent, arising and passing away based on a vast, seamless web of causes and conditions. The true nature of this interdependent reality is the Dharmakaya, the truth body of the Buddha, which is often described as a boundless, luminous, non-dual awareness that is the ground of all manifestation. While Buddhism carefully deconstructs the notion of a permanent self or soul, the experience of awakening is one of realizing the non-separation between the perceiver and the perceived, the self and the world. In the deepest states of meditation, the sense of a solid I observing a separate that dissolves, leaving only a unified field of experiencing. This direct perception of non-duality is the realization of the Dharmakaya, and it bears a profound experiential resemblance to the Neoplatonists' ecstatic union with the One, where the soul becomes what it sees and is no longer a spectator but a participant in the divine reality. So how do these ancient traditions, separated by vast continents and cultures, propose we actualize this understanding? The methods are strikingly complementary. The Advaita Vedanta path of neti, not this is a contemplative process of negating everything that is not the ultimate reality. You inquire into your own experience. Am I the body? No. Am I the sensations? No. Am I the thoughts? No. By systematically discarding every transient, finite identification, you arrive at what remains the silent, witnessing consciousness that is your true nature, which is Brahman. This is a precise parallel to the Neoplatonic practice of apophasis, or negative theology, where one describes the One by saying what it is not. It is not finite, not multiple, not limited, not definable. This disciplined negation cleanses the mind of its habitual, limiting concepts, creating the empty, receptive space necessary for a direct, non-conceptual glimpse of the transcendent. Similarly, the Buddhist practice of mindfulness and insight meditation, or vipassana, leads to a deconstruction of the sense of a solid self by observing the impermanent, conditioned nature of all mental and physical phenomena. As you watch thoughts arise and pass without identifying with them, the illusion of a central controller begins to unravel, revealing the open, aware space in which the entire dance of existence unfolds. This is the experiential discovery of non-duality, not as a philosophical idea, but as a lived reality. In the West, the Neoplatonists had their own version of this in the Ascent Up the Ladder of Love and the practice of Theurgy, both designed to turn the soul's attention away from the multifarious world of the senses and toward the unifying source. The modern seeker, then, is presented with a magnificent tapestry of wisdom. Whether you are drawn to the intellectual rigor of Plotinus, the self-inquiry of Advaita, or the mindful awareness of Buddhism, you are navigating different trails up the same mountain. This is the essence of the perennial philosophy, the recognition that a universal, transcendent truth lies at the core of the world's spiritual traditions, expressing itself through different cultural and philosophical dialects. Framing Neoplatonism in this light elevates it from a historical relic to a vital, living pathway. It shows that the yearning to transcend the pain of separation and realize our fundamental unity with all that is not a Eastern import, but a native impulse of the Western soul, one that was articulated with profound clarity 2,000 years ago. This perspective offers a powerful antidote to the pervasive sense of alienation and fragmentation in the modern world, providing a coherent map for the deepest journey any human can undertake, the journey from the illusion of being a separate self to the glorious, liberating truth that all is, and always has been, one. Yet understanding why this profound system of thought had to be recovered at all forces us to confront a difficult and often brutal chapter in history. The disappearance of Neoplatonism was not a simple matter of philosophical trends shifting or a school of thought naturally falling out of fashion. This was a deliberate and systematic suppression, a multi-pronged campaign spanning centuries that aimed to dismantle a rival worldview and establish a new, exclusive orthodoxy. While Emperor Justinian's closure of the Athenian Academy in 529 serves as a powerful symbolic endpoint, it was merely the final, official act in a much longer and more complex process of erasure. To truly grasp how this knowledge was lost, we must look at the rising tide of Orthodox Christianity as it transformed from a persecuted sect into the official religion of the Roman Empire, a shift that placed it in direct and unavoidable competition with the established pagan intellectual tradition. For the new state-sanctioned church, Neoplatonism represented an existential threat. It wasn't just a different set of beliefs, It was a sophisticated, all-encompassing alternative that offered a path to salvation without requiring faith in Christ as the sole Savior. The Neoplatonic system had its own transcendental source in the One, its own path to redemption through philosophical assent and theurgic practice, and its own spiritual authorities in figures like Plato and Plotinus. This made it dangerously attractive to educated, spiritually seeking individuals, potentially drawing them away from the burgeoning Christian community. Furthermore, the very structure of Neoplatonism was deeply problematic from a Christian theological perspective. Its concept of emanation, where divinity flows outward in a necessary and eternal cascade, challenged the Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo, the belief that God created the universe from nothing by a deliberate act of will. In the Neoplatonic view, the material world was a natural, albeit distant, expression of the divine, which stood in stark contrast to certain Christian tendencies that viewed the physical realm and the human body with suspicion as a site of sin and temptation. Perhaps most alarmingly for church authorities, the practice of Theurgy, the ritual invocation of gods and daemons, was indistinguishable from what they defined as demonic magic. The animated statues, the chants to Hecate, the seeking of oracles from divine beings other than the Christian God, all of this was seen not as a noble spiritual technology, but as trafficking with fallen angels and malevolent spirits, leading the soul to eternal damnation. This theological incompatibility was weaponized into political action. As Christian emperors consolidated power, they began issuing a series of edicts aimed at dismantling the infrastructure of paganism. While the famous Edict of Theodosius in the late 4th century is often cited as a blanket ban, the process was more gradual and regional. Temples, which were not just places of worship but also centers of learning and repositories for texts, had their funding cut, were forcibly closed, or were destroyed by zealous mobs, often with imperial acquiescence. The Serapeum, the magnificent temple of Serapis in Alexandria that housed a daughter library of the great Musaean, was famously razed to the ground by a Christian mob in the late 4th century, a catastrophic loss of countless scrolls and a stark warning to the intellectual community. This physical destruction was accompanied by a powerful literary and rhetorical campaign of demonization. Early church fathers, who were often deeply educated in classical philosophy themselves, engaged in a complex dance of appropriation and rejection. A figure like St. Augustine, for instance, had been profoundly influenced by Neoplatonic texts, which helped him conceive of God as an immaterial spirit. Yet in his later writings, he strategically mined Neoplatonism for ideas that supported Christian doctrine, while vehemently rejecting its core practices and its pluralistic theology. He and others like him framed the pagan gods as deceptive demons and labeled the theurgic rites as dangerous sorcery. This created a powerful narrative that associated the entire spiritual ecosystem of Neoplatonism with evil, effectively criminalizing its practice and pushing its adherents into secrecy. This systematic suppression created a chilling effect that lasted for generations. As the old pagan aristocracy lost influence and the educational system was slowly Christianized, the social and intellectual networks needed to transmit this complex, esoteric knowledge simply withered away. A young man seeking an education in the 6th or 7th century would no longer be sent to Athens or Alexandria to study the Enneads of Plotinus. He would be educated in a monastic or cathedral school focused on the church fathers and the scriptures. The language of spiritual seeking itself changed. The nuanced, multi-leveled cosmology of the Neoplatonists, with its mediating daemons and its world soul, was replaced by a more dualistic cosmos of God, angels, saints, and demons. The very words used to describe their practices, words like theurgy and philosophy, in its original, spiritual sense, were either forgotten or redefined as heresy. The knowledge wasn't just banned, its context for being understood was systematically dismantled. This is why we speak of it as being lost. It was not merely misplaced, but actively buried beneath the accumulating layers of a new dominant culture that had a vested interest in ensuring its rival remained forgotten, its profound insights fragmented and its powerful practices silenced for 1,000 years. So where does this leave us today, standing amidst the gleaming towers of a technological age, armed with more information than any previous generation, yet often feeling a profound and aching sense of disconnect? The lost knowledge of the Neoplatonists arrives not as a dusty artifact, but as a vital and urgent corrective, a philosophical and spiritual toolkit for a world struggling with the twin perils of a disenchanted universe and the rigid certainties of fundamentalism. On one side, we face the dominant narrative of scientific materialism, which, for all its incredible benefits, often portrays reality as a meaningless accident in a cold, mechanical cosmos, where consciousness is a fleeting byproduct of brain chemistry and human life is without inherent purpose. This story, while powerful, has left a spiritual vacuum, a deep hunger for meaning that it cannot fulfill. On the other side, we see the reactive rise of rigid religious and ideological fundamentalisms, which offer certainty and belonging but often at the cost of intellectual freedom, compassionate inquiry, and a genuine engagement with the complexities of the modern world. Neoplatonism offers a profound third way, a bridge between these two extremes. It presents a universe that is both rationally ordered and sacred to its core, a cosmos that can be studied by science precisely because it is the product of a divine, intelligent source. This is not a worldview that asks you to choose between your mind and your spirit. It invites you to use your reason as a sacred faculty to explore a reality that is itself the living expression of a supreme intelligence. This holistic perspective finds one of its most powerful modern expressions in the ecological crisis. For centuries, a worldview that saw nature as a mere resource to be exploited, a dead mechanism to be mastered, has brought us to the brink of environmental collapse. The Neoplatonic concept of the anima mundi, the world soul, provides a philosophical foundation for a truly sacred ecology. It tells us that the Earth is not a collection of inert objects, but a single, vast, living being. The forests are not just lumber, they are the lungs of this planetary entity. The rivers are not just plumbing, they are its circulatory system. When you grasp this idea, environmentalism ceases to be merely a political or ethical stance. It becomes a matter of spiritual and physical self-preservation. To pollute a river is not just an economic externality. It is an act of violence against the living body of which we are a part. This worldview fosters a relationship with nature based not on domination, but on reverence and participation. It encourages us to listen to the intelligence inherent in ecosystems, to learn from their balances and cycles, and to see ourselves not as separate managers of the environment, but as conscious cells within a planetary organism, with a responsibility to contribute to its health and harmony. This shift from seeing the world as a machine to experiencing it as a living presence is perhaps one of the most critical transformations required for our survival, and it is a perspective the Neoplatonists articulated with breathtaking clarity. Beyond this cosmic realignment, this ancient tradition offers a practical and deeply personal path of spiritual development, a step-by-step methodology for inner ascent that is as relevant now as it was in Alexandria. In a world of endless distraction and surface-level stimulation, the Neoplatonic path is a call to depth, to the cultivation of an inner life. It provides a structured approach to what many seekers today are intuitively trying to do, reconnect with a sense of the sacred within themselves. The journey begins exactly where you are, with the raw material of your own experience. The first step is the practice of self-knowledge, which for the Neoplatonists was far more than psychological introspection. It is the disciplined effort to observe the chaos of your own mind, the fleeting desires, the chattering thoughts, the turbulent emotions, and to begin to distinguish between this ever-changing stream of content and the stable, aware consciousness that is witnessing it all. This is the initial turn inward, the realization that you are not merely your thoughts, but the awareness in which thoughts appear. Modern mindfulness and meditation practices are powerful tools for this very stage, helping to quiet the noise so you can begin to hear the whisper of your deeper self. From this foundation of stillness, the path then unfolds through the appreciation of beauty, what Plotinus called the ladder of love. This is not an abstract theory, but a daily practice you can apply to your life. It starts by consciously engaging with the beauty that already moves you, a piece of music that gives you chills, a film that brings you to tears, the staggering elegance of a mathematical equation, or the simple perfection of a flower in bloom. The key is to not just consume these experiences passively, but to use them as portals. When you are captivated by a beautiful painting, don't stop at the surface. Ask yourself, what is the principle of harmony, balance, or meaning that this object is manifesting? You are training yourself to look through the physical form, to perceive the invisible archetype of beauty that it reflects. This reflective practice then naturally extends to the beauty of human character. You begin to see the same divine harmony expressed in acts of courage, compassion, and integrity. A selfless act of kindness shines with a light that is more brilliant and enduring than any physical form, because it is a more direct expression of the soul's alignment with the good. The final stage of this ascent is the direct turning inward, the practice of contemplation. This is where you set aside all external images, all concepts, and even the sense of a separate self, to rest in pure, undifferentiated awareness. It is in these profound moments of silence that the soul can have a direct, non-conceptual taste of its source, a glimpse of the unity that underlies all things. This is not an escape from the world, but a diving into its deepest reality. You return from such an experience transformed, carrying a newfound sense of peace, compassion, and clarity back into your everyday life. The entire path is a democratization of the mystical experience. It says that you don't need to be a recluse or a sage to begin this journey. You can start right now, with the beauty before your eyes, the silence within your own heart, and the sincere desire to know who you truly are beyond the temporary story of your life. In an age of fragmentation and existential anxiety, the Neoplatonists offer a map home not to a distant heaven, but to the sacred center of your own being, and in doing so, they reveal that the universe itself is not a cold, empty space, but a living, conscious, and endlessly fascinating conversation between the one and the many, a conversation in which you are an essential and irreplaceable voice from the vibrant intellectual pressure cooker of 3rd century Alexandria, where the seeds of this wisdom were first sown by Ammonius Saccas and brought to full flower by the mystical genius of Plotinus. We have traced an epic journey spanning continents and millennia. We witnessed the construction of a complete spiritual universe, emanating from the silent, ineffable one, cascading through the perfect, self-aware realm of the divine mind, and animating the entire cosmos through a living world soul. We followed the daring descent of the human soul into the material world, not as a punishment, but as a divine expedition to bring order and beauty to the furthest frontiers of existence. We saw how this grand philosophical map was complemented by the sacred technology of Theurgy, a ritual science for tuning the soul to the frequencies of the divine, and how it was systematically codified by luminous minds like Iamblichus and Proclus into the most sophisticated spiritual system of the ancient world. Yet this brilliant light was not destined to burn unchecked. We felt the chilling shadow of suppression fall, from the brutal murder of Hypatia to the imperial edict that shuttered the academy in Athens, scattering the last guardians of this knowledge into exile. For 1,000 years, this river of light flowed underground, its waters preserved and enriched in the translation houses of Baghdad, where it fueled a golden age of Islamic philosophy and mysticism, and then surged back into the West with the fall of Constantinople, igniting the creative fire of the Renaissance. It inspired the art of Botticelli, the syncretic dreams of Ficino, and the serene reason of the Cambridge Platonists, before finding new voices in the passionate cries of the Romantics and ultimately revealing its enduring truth in the psychological depths charted by Carl Jung. This is not merely a history of ideas. It is the biography of a living tradition, a perennial philosophy that has consistently re-emerged whenever humanity has felt itself trapped between the cold void of a meaningless cosmos and the rigid cage of dogmatic certainty. It offers a third path, a vision of a universe that is rationally ordered yet sacred to its core, where your own consciousness is not an accidental glitch but a conscious fragment of the cosmos itself on a heroic journey of return. And this is where the story turns from a historical narrative into a personal invitation. The recovery of this lost knowledge is not complete. It is an ongoing project, and it now passes to you. You are living in a time when the essential elements of this wisdom are more accessible than they have been for centuries. The choice is yours to become an active participant in this great chain of seeking. See yourself not as a passive consumer of information, but as a modern theurgist using the tools of your own life, your moments of awe in nature, your encounters with beauty in art and music, your pursuit of self-knowledge through meditation or introspection, your acts of compassion and creativity as the very instruments for polishing the mirror of your own soul. Your life, with all its complexities and challenges, is the sacred laboratory where this ancient wisdom can be tested and made real. The journey of remembrance is yours to undertake. We have spent this time unraveling a magnificent tapestry, but its true value is revealed only when you begin to weave its threads into the fabric of your own experience. The comment section below is more than just a space for feedback. Consider it a modern-day agora, a digital gathering place for a community of seekers. Share what resonated with you the most. Was it the concept of the world soul that transformed how you see nature? Did the ladder of love give you a new perspective on beauty? Have you had moments that felt like a glimpse of that unifying one? Your insights and questions are the next chapter in this timeless story. By sharing them, you help to keep this river of light flowing, ensuring that the lost knowledge of the Neoplatonists continues to find its way home, one awakened soul at a time.